Welcome to tonight's sleep story. This evening, I invite you to drift with me through a history not of kings or empires, but of invisible battles. Quiet, whispered, unseen. A history that begins not in any one country, but before countries existed at all. Long before cities had names or prayers had words. Before there were scriptures, before there were churches, before humanity had even written its first symbol into clay. There was the fear of something we could sense but not see. Tonight, we journey into the entire history of exorcisms, a story as old as human fear itself. A story about what ancient people believed lived behind illness, behind madness, behind dreams and storms, and unexplainable misfortune. A story of rituals performed in shadows, of chants carried across deserts and mountains, of sacred objects passed through hands now long turned to dust. A story that begins in fire-lit caves and ends in MRI machines and film studios, with thousands of years between. And yet a question that has not truly changed. Before we begin, I'd love it if you could take a moment to comment where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you there. Every night, this community gathers from every corner of the earth, from candlelit bedrooms in India to high-rise apartments in New York, from quiet mountain towns to warm tropical nights, each of you choosing to end your day immersed in story. Your presence here is what brings these histories back to life. Now, place your phone on Do Not Disturb. Let the outside world pause. Adjust your pillow beneath your head. Feel the steady rhythm of your breath and allow the long arc of time to open gently before you. You do not need to stay awake for every moment. These stories will keep going even if you drift away. They will shape themselves to your dreams. Imagine, just for a moment, the world before explanation, before germs or neurology or the word hallucination existed. A world where every flicker of candlelight could be a sign, every fever a message, every voice heard in an empty room, an intrusion from somewhere unseen. A world where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was not a question. It was a constant presence. Tonight, we will walk that entire path. From the very first belief that something beyond the human could enter the human, to the rituals carved in clay on riverbanks in Mesopotamia, to the temples of Egypt and the chants of Vedic India, to early Christianity and its war over the invisible, to medieval Europe's fear of possession and witchcraft, to science's attempt to erase it, to the moment film brought it roaring back into modern consciousness, and even to now, where neurologists, priests, and psychologists quietly agree that the story is not finished. So, settle in. Make yourself as comfortable as you can. There is nothing you need to do except listen. This is the entire history of exorcisms, from the dawn of belief to the modern day. The first belief in spirits, before writing, had a name, long before the first temple was raised, before the first priest existed, before even language had settled into anything we would recognize as speech. There were nights where early humans sat in the dark and listened to things they could not explain. This chapter belongs to that world, a world without scripture, but not without belief. There were no religions yet, no organized prayers, no written spells, no doctrines, no concept of heaven or hell. And yet, there was already the idea that there were forces beyond the human, not imagined as mythic gods or winged creatures, not with names or personalities or allegiances, just a feeling, an ancient certainty that consciousness was not limited to the body. It likely began with death, a child who had been laughing by the fire the night before, now suddenly still, completely, impossibly motionless. The eyes no longer containing someone, only something. The body there, the person gone. Something had left. There was no other way to interpret it. To the earliest humans, death was not merely loss, it was evidence. The body was clearly not the person. Something could enter, animate, and leave. That was the first doorway to the idea of spirits, and what leaves, many believed, might also return, intentionally, accidentally, or restlessly. This was not religion yet. This was pattern recognition born of necessity. Early humans were unbelievably observant. They had to be. A 1-degree change in wind direction meant the herd was moving. A broken twig meant danger. A night of strange dreams followed by disease or disaster. That meant something had caused it. In a world without randomness, everything was agency. The flicker of a shadow was not wind. The whisper of reeds was not empty. The sudden chill at night where others felt warmth was not simply the air. Children who woke screaming from dreams were not merely frightened. They had been touched. The dead had not left. And perhaps, nor had other things. We know, from the oldest burial sites, over 100,000 years old, that this belief was not only emotional, but ritualized. Graves full of ochre, antlers, food, tools, gifts for the journey. Not superstition, preparation, expectation. The awareness that something would continue beyond the body. And if something continued, something could linger. Somewhere in that space, between the living body and the silent body, the concept of spirit entered the human mind. From there, a second realization followed. If something can enter at birth and leave at death, then perhaps it can enter at other times too. In illness, when a fever took over the body, twisting it into sweats and tremors. When a person began speaking in sounds not understood, or when they became suddenly aggressive, unrecognizable. It was not madness. It was invasion. Not unwellness. Unwanted presence. Possession, before it had a name. The earliest exorcisms were not performed ceremonies. They were survival reactions. A mother placing her body between a trembling child and the void she believed had reached for it. A community chanting or shaking or making sound not because of doctrine, but because noise itself disrupted something unseen. Fire was kept not merely for warmth, but because it was, somehow, a barrier. Smoke was not only a chemical irritant to mosquitoes. It was a boundary drawn in the invisible, a signal to whatever moved in darkness that here is life. Do not enter. Everything in this world was physical and spiritual simultaneously. Illness had no separate category from curse. Madness had no divide from haunting. A cold wind entering the lungs was the same as a spirit entering the body. Both were invasion. This was a world where fear was not irrational. It was the most intelligent thing to have. And so, already, without speaking the term, humanity had accepted a truth that would outlive every empire, every god, every reform and revolution. That the human being is not entirely alone in itself. That the body can be home or doorway. That something could cross the threshold without asking. This belief, this primal awareness, predates every religion we know. It is older than writing, older than myth, older even than agriculture. It is the root beneath thousands of years of ritual to come. From whispered names of gods to official rites sanctioned by powerful institutions. From painted cave smoke to golden censers in stone cathedrals. It began with a single awareness, held by people who did not yet have words. Something can enter us, and we may need to find a way to make it leave. Ancient Mesopotamia and the birth of ritual protection. In the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, long before Greece, before Egypt's great pyramids lifted their angles toward the desert sun, before the names of gods were carved in marble or sung in Rome, there rose cities of clay and copper and fire. Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, cities whose names once commanded the attention of kings, whose very existence was a declaration that humanity had not merely survived the ancient world, it intended to organize it. This was Mesopotamia, cradle of agriculture, of mathematics, of written law, and just as profoundly, cradle of the first recorded technologies of spiritual defense. Here, more than any civilization before it, people did not merely feel the presence of spirits. They believed they were negotiating with them at every moment. Illness was not random. Madness was not madness. Dreams were not private. In Mesopotamia, everything was caused by someone or something. They did not view the world as empty, waiting to be filled by human meaning. It was already crowded, an invisible ecology of unseen beings, many benevolent, many neutral, many dangerous, all watchful, all responsive, gods of sky, wind, storm, fertility, writing, judgment, spirits of dust devils, ruined fields, stagnant waters, spirits of the restless dead whose names were forgotten, spirits that lurked not in distant heavens or caves of myth, but in homes, in water jars, behind doorways, in the flickering dark between lamplight and shadow. And just as rivers needed irrigation and walls needed maintenance, the unseen world needed management. This is where exorcism as a system truly begins. The Mesopotamians were the first civilization in known history to treat spiritual intrusion not as pure terror, but as a diagnosable, nameable, and correctable event. Not every spirit was evil, but every spirit had intention. And if intention could be understood, then it could be navigated, pleaded with, threatened, expelled. From this, the figure of the Ashipu emerged. A priest exorcist, but not a preacher, not a mystic, a specialist, a technician of the unseen. He studied for years to understand which forces caused which disturbances, which rituals belonged to which spirits, which divine names could compel obedience. He was equal parts healer, judge, astronomer, lawyer of the metaphysical. But here is what made Mesopotamia unlike anything that came before. They wrote it down, on clay tablets, in cuneiform. They left exorcism manuals, methodical, precise, procedural. The oldest surviving demonology on earth. Not poetry, not myth. Instruction. A typical text would not say, "Evil spirit, begone." It would say, in paraphrased concept, "If the afflicted is feverish, trembling at night, speaking in confusion, burning with unnatural heat, then invoke the name of the god, Ea. Burn tamarisk over an oil flame. Draw a boundary line of flour around the bed. Recite this incantation precisely 3 times, with the right hand extended, and send the spirit back to the underworld from which it came." This was not superstition to them. This was preventative infrastructure. Houses were reinforced not merely with wooden beams, but with buried figurines of guardian spirits, sealed beneath foundations, arranged at thresholds. Travelers carried metal amulets etched with curses against demons of the night. Women in childbirth wore effigies of Pazuzu, a winged, terrifying demon, not because he was good, but because he was more feared by predators of the vulnerable than anything else. Fear was weaponized against fear. It is impossible to overstate. They did not pray blindly. They invoked by name. Names were everything. A spirit once named could be confronted, addressed directly, and most importantly, commanded. Because if Mesopotamia had one foundational belief about exorcism, it was this: if the ritual is correct, the spirit has no choice. The universe was not chaos to them. It was legal, structured, hierarchical. Even demons followed protocol. If you followed the ritual correctly, if you invoked the right superior god, the possessing force had to obey, not by mercy, but by metaphysical obligation. The priest did not cry out in terror. He spoke like an advocate, as though delivering a verdict. Exorcism in Mesopotamia was not panic, it was enforcement. And in this, we witness the first true birth of ritual protection. Not random fear, not improvisation, not raw faith held desperately in the dark, but a crafted, repeatable, transmissible technology of the sacred. One meant not merely to react, but to preempt, to defend the living long before harm reached them. In this moment, in clay tablets sealed beneath temple floors, in chants that treated the unseen not as unknowable mystery, but as a knowable, negotiable force, we see the first great turning point in the story of exorcism. Not an act of superstition, but the first attempt to regulate the invisible. And that idea, that what cannot be seen can still be governed, would travel, change, survive empires, and echo forward across millennia, all the way to Rome, to the Vatican, to modern hospitals, and to the world we live in now. But first, before science, before Europe, before Abrahamic faiths, the spiritual order took on another shape. In the kingdom of the Nile, Egyptian Ka, Ba, and the battle for the human soul. Along the fertile crescent of the Nile, where the river's slow green ribbon cut through the desert sands, humanity began to understand life, death, and the soul in ways that were as structured as the towering monuments they built. Ancient Egypt, rising as a civilization shortly after Mesopotamia, became a world in which the unseen and the seen were intimately, inseparably intertwined. Here, the struggle against what might possess, haunt, or corrupt the human spirit became not only a matter of survival, as it had been in Mesopotamia, but a profound journey into the essence of being itself. The Egyptians did not merely fear invasion by spirits, they sought to define what it was that could be invaded. Unlike the Mesopotamians, who treated spirits largely as extrinsic agents acting upon the body, the Egyptians conceived of the human being as composed of multiple, interrelated parts, aspects that could wander, be threatened, or be taken, but also aspects that could endure beyond the body. These were the Ka, the Ba, the Ren, and the Ak. Together, they formed a complex system of consciousness and presence, of which the Ka and Ba were the most central to the problem of spiritual intrusion and protection. The Ka was understood as the life force. It was not a soul in the abstract philosophical sense, but the animating energy that distinguished the living from the dead. A person without a Ka was not simply dead. They were absent in a way that defied return. The Ka had needs. It required sustenance, rituals, offerings, and acknowledgement from the living. It could be threatened, stolen, or diverted, especially at times of extreme vulnerability, such as during illness, trauma, or exposure to powerful spiritual forces. The Ba was complementary, yet distinct. Often represented in art as a bird with a human head, the Ba was the aspect of personality, the essence that could move freely between the worlds of the living and the dead. It could leave the body at night during sleep, wander the realm of spirits, and return at dawn. This mobility made it especially susceptible to forces that sought to manipulate, hinder, or imprison it. The Egyptians understood that the Ba's freedom was essential to the person's health and wholeness. If it failed to return, the body and the Ka alone were incomplete. In this understanding, we can see the early foundation of exorcistic thought. The human self was not unitary but modular, a network of forces constantly interacting with the environment. Illness, madness, inexplicable death, and violent or unpredictable behavior were often interpreted not as failures of the body alone, but as attacks upon one or more of these essential components. Spirits did not merely act externally, they could intrude into the very structure of the human essence. The Egyptians responded with systems of protection that were at once ritualized and systematic. Amulets, inscriptions, protective figurines, and incantations were crafted with meticulous care. The Book of the Dead, a compendium of spells, instructions, and prayers, served as both a guide for the dead and a map for the living, showing them how to maintain the integrity of the Ka and Bea in life, and to defend them after death. The spells were precise, with designated words, gestures, and offerings, because the Egyptians understood, as had the Mesopotamians, that ritual efficacy depended upon accuracy. One of the most striking elements of Egyptian spiritual protection was the use of magical and religious symbiosis. Temples were not merely places of worship, but centers of continuous spiritual maintenance. Priests performed daily rituals, not just to honor gods, but to ensure that the forces governing life and death remained in balance, that the ka and ba of the community and of individuals remained shielded from corruption. Homes, too, were designed with spiritual defense in mind. Doorways might be inscribed with protective words. Threshold statues of fierce animals and deities served as guardians against wandering spirits. Even tombs were structured as spiritual fortresses, designed to preserve the deceased's ka and ba, and prevent them from being trapped or harmed by hostile forces in the netherworld. It is in this cultural matrix that we first encounter the Egyptian conception of battle for the human soul, in a literal and symbolic sense. Possession, intrusion, and spiritual attack were real threats, and they were fought with a combination of ritual, knowledge, and imagination. A wandering ba, lost or obstructed, could lead to illness. A ka weakened by neglect or attack could fail, leaving the body vulnerable to decay or malevolent spirits. Spells were crafted to restore balance, to repel intruders, to reclaim the components of self that had been endangered. And as with Mesopotamian tradition, the spoken word was the tool of authority. Correctly recited, a spell could compel a spirit to obey. Mispronounced, misunderstood, or omitted, it could invite calamity. The Egyptians also extended this protective reasoning to the natural world. Rivers, trees, deserts, and stars were not neutral. They were imbued with the same forces that could possess or protect humans. Certain animals, birds, and insects carried divine or demonic associations. Cats, revered and sacred, were guardians against chaos, while serpents were often understood as agents of both danger and transformation. Ritual, observation, and structured interaction with the environment became part of a comprehensive strategy for survival against the unseen. Dreams were a particular arena of concern. Egyptians believed that in sleep, the ba could leave the body and interact with other realms, including realms where malevolent spirits could influence, observe, or attempt possession. Dream interpretation, preemptive ritual, and careful nighttime practices were employed to ensure the safe return of the ba each morning. Similarly, rites surrounding childbirth were intensely ritualized, as newborns were considered highly vulnerable. The care of infants required constant attention and protection, and specific spells and charms were deployed to guard both mother and child against the forces that threatened the integrity of their spirits. Interestingly, Egyptian thought introduced a profound ethical dimension to spiritual protection. It was not sufficient merely to defend. Humans were encouraged to live in alignment with the cosmic order, the Mayat. Correct speech, action, and intention were as important as ritual objects and chants. The spiritual universe was understood as a system of relationships, human to human, human to divine, human to spirit, and imbalance could invite invasion or disruption. Thus, the first exorcisms in Egypt were not merely acts of defense, they were expressions of cosmic maintenance, a continuous negotiation between humans, gods, and the multitudes of unseen entities that filled the world. The sophistication of Egyptian spiritual thought, combining precise ritual, symbolic understanding of the human psyche, and systematic approaches to protection, marks a significant evolution in the history of exorcism. Whereas Mesopotamia had introduced the idea of systematic defense against spirits, Egypt elaborated upon it, giving shape to the architecture of the soul itself, defining the components that required protection and creating methods to preserve them both in life and after death. And so, within the rhythmic life along the Nile, the human being was no longer simply a body inhabited by mysterious forces. The person became a network of interdependent spiritual energies, each susceptible to invasion, each capable of restoration. The Ka, the Ba, the Ren, the Ak, these were the axes upon which life turned. To lose one was not merely misfortune, it was a crisis of existence. Exorcism here became not a desperate act of defense, but a profound engagement with the essence of being itself. In this way, the Egyptians expanded upon the earliest human realization that something invisible could affect the living. They translated fear into understanding, chaos into system, intuition into codified practice. Their rituals, spells, and beliefs would echo far beyond the Nile, influencing the spiritual traditions of Greece, Rome, and later Abrahamic religions. And at the center of it all, the human soul remained both precious and precarious, a constellation of energies constantly engaged in the eternal struggle to remain whole. The Ka and Ba were never static. They were alive, fluid, and dynamic, moving between worlds, threatened by forces beyond comprehension, yet shielded by words, gestures, and objects. They were the earliest articulation of the notion that possession is not only intrusion, but a battle for the very essence of humanity. In understanding this, we see the continuity between the primal human awareness of spirits and the complex ritual systems that would come to define exorcism for millennia. It is along this Nile, amid the rhythm of the seasons and the rise and fall of dynasties, that humanity first begins to conceptualize the soul, not as a singular entity, but as a constellation of energies, a battlefield, and a treasure to be safeguarded. It is here that exorcism begins to acquire its dual character, both practical protection and philosophical reflection, a careful negotiation between fear and understanding, between the seen and the unseen, between life and the possibility of what could enter, linger, and take. The oracles of Greece and the language of divine possession. In the lands that would one day be called Greece, where rugged mountains rise abruptly from the fertile plains, and where the wind carries the scent of salt from the distant seas, humanity encountered the unseen in forms at once terrifying and fascinating, intimate and vast. Here, the human encounter with the spiritual took on a new texture. Whereas the Mesopotamians had codified the actions of spirits, and the Egyptians had mapped the architecture of the soul itself, the Greeks turned inward and outward simultaneously, exploring the invisible through speech, prophecy, and possession. It began with the oracles. Across the Greek world, from Delphi to Dodona, from the shores of the Aegean to hidden mountain shrines, sacred women and men served as conduits between mortals and the divine. They were not simply advisors or fortune-tellers. They were living thresholds, human beings through whom the gods could speak, move, and, in a sense, act upon the world. Their voices, trembling or trance-like, conveyed messages whose origin was not themselves but the unseen powers that had entered them. The Greeks believed that possession was not inherently malevolent. It was, instead, a form of communication, a momentary alignment of mortal consciousness with forces beyond comprehension. A person might be struck by a divine presence, uttering words they did not know, foreseeing events they could not have deduced, moving in ways they could not control. This was divine speech. It was possession transformed into language, into narrative, into ritual action. It was the realization that the body could be an instrument for forces far larger than itself, that the self was porous, capable of hosting the unknowable. At Delphi, the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, would enter the sacred chamber above the chasm from which vapors arose, inhaling what the Greeks called the breath of the god. She would tremble, lose the ordinary coherence of her mind, and speak in a voice that seemed fragmented yet somehow comprehensible, interpreted by priests for those who sought guidance. The Greeks understood that these moments of possession were both terrifying and necessary, chaotic yet ordered. The Pythia herself was not in total control, yet she was essential. Her body was the vessel through which divine law and counsel flowed. This conception of spiritual intrusion and mediation profoundly shaped Greek culture. It introduced the idea that possession could be legitimate, even sacred, rather than solely dangerous. Unlike earlier civilizations, where spirits were adversaries to be expelled, in Greece a spirit might enter willingly, bringing knowledge, warning, or intervention. And yet this same system recognized peril. The gods were not uniformly benevolent. Dionysus, for example, was a god whose presence in a human mind could inspire ecstatic vision, artistic brilliance, and revelatory insight, yet could just as easily drive frenzy, irrationality, and violence. The Greeks accepted that the divine was volatile, and that the line between inspiration and madness was narrow, porous, and shifting. Greek ritual surrounding divine possession was precise, methodical, and ceremonial, though it relied on a different logic than Mesopotamian incantations or Egyptian soul protection. Here, music, dance, fasting, and incubation, sleeping within sacred temples to receive visions, became tools to prepare both body and soul for contact with the divine. An individual might seek entrance into an altered state, understanding that possession, if invited and controlled, could be enlightening. But if the spirit or God came unbidden, if the thresholds were crossed without care, the result could be destructive, both socially and personally. Greek culture also extended the logic of possession into civic and philosophical life. It was not only priests or priestesses who might host a divine presence. Poets, prophets, and mystics were all considered capable of channeling the unseen. Their words, whether sung in epic or whispered in oracular chambers, carried authority precisely because they were believed to be transmissions, not inventions. The human body became both a medium and a message, a site where the sacred could intersect with the mortal. Medicine, philosophy, and religion intertwined in this context. Hippocrates and his followers began to observe that some disturbances might be physiological, yet they did not dismiss the possibility of spirit intervention. Madness could be natural, but it could also be divine, a sign that the individual was hosting a force too powerful to ignore. Socrates, too, spoke of his daimon, an inner voice guiding his actions, illustrating that the Greeks recognized possession not merely an externalized phenomena, but as an internal moral and spiritual negotiation. The daimon was neither wholly personal nor wholly alien. It was a liminal force residing between the human and divine, the interior and exterior. Every temple, shrine, and ritual in Greece was designed to navigate this delicate balance. Offerings were made to attract favorable spirits and appease dangerous ones. Words were chosen with care, dances performed with precision. Priests interpreted every utterance of the possessed, seeking meaning in fragmented speech. Songs were composed, and in their repetition, the rhythms themselves became protective, warding against unwanted intrusion or maintaining alignment between mortal and divine energies. Festivals such as the Dionysian rites blurred the boundary further, creating communal spaces where ecstatic possession was not only accepted but celebrated, allowing individuals to experience firsthand the fluidity of consciousness, the permeability of self, and the potential for the divine to move through flesh and bone. The Greek understanding of possession was thus profoundly nuanced. The human being was not merely a target for malevolent forces. The body could be a vessel of revelation, the mind a channel through which truths beyond ordinary comprehension might be spoken. And yet, this permeability came with responsibility, danger, and constant negotiation. The balance between control and surrender, between fear and openness, was the very essence of ritual life. To host a spirit was to confront the limits of identity, to acknowledge the fragility of self while simultaneously participating in forces greater than any single person could contain. It is here, in Greece, that exorcism begins to acquire an added dimension. Not only the act of expelling or defending against spirits, but the interpretive art of understanding their language. If a spirit speaks through the body, one must listen, decipher, and respond. Misinterpretation could provoke disrespect or worsen the intrusion. Ritual became dialogue, possession became text, and the practitioner of spiritual defense became both scholar and mediator. Knowledge, observation, and empathy became as important as chants or gestures. Through these developments, the Greeks articulated a profound insight that the human being is neither fully autonomous nor fully passive. We are permeable, capable of receiving both insight and invasion, divine guidance and chaos. Exorcism, prophecy, possession, and interpretation are thus interwoven threads, creating a tapestry in which the body, soul, mind, and environment interact in continuous, intricate dialogue with forces both visible and unseen. In this understanding, we see the continuity and evolution of human engagement with the unseen. From the pragmatic defenses of Mesopotamia to the protective architecture of the Egyptian soul, the Greeks introduced a new dimension, the encounter with the invisible as language, as dialogue, as an exchange that shapes consciousness itself. The human being is not merely a battlefield, it is also a participant, a recipient, and a medium through which the sacred manifests. It is along these mountains and shores, within the temples and sacred groves, that possession becomes something beyond fear. A profound, structured interaction with forces that are at once terrifying, illuminating, and ineffably powerful. The Greeks understood that the unseen was not merely to be banished, but also to be read, respected, and sometimes embraced. In this subtle sophistication, we witness the unfolding complexity of exorcism as a practice, as a philosophy, and as a reflection of the eternal human desire to comprehend what lies beyond the threshold of ordinary perception. Here, in the shadowed columns of the oracular temple, in the tremulous words of the Pythia, in the ecstatic dances of Dionysian worshippers, the invisible world is neither wholly benign nor entirely hostile. It is a presence demanding attention, negotiation, and understanding. And it is here, in Greece, that the language of divine possession becomes fully articulated, not as a threat to be destroyed, but as a message to be heard, interpreted, and, when necessary, mediated. The Greeks, in their mountains, groves, and temples, created a paradigm in which the human body is simultaneously vessel, interpreter, and battlefield. The unseen is not an abstraction. It is a presence whose influence can be felt, whose voice can be translated, and whose intrusion can be mitigated or invited. This chapter in human history reveals the evolution of spiritual defense into something both disciplined and poetic, systematic and unpredictable, fearsome and illuminating. It is from this foundation that later civilizations, from Rome to early Christian communities, would inherit and transform the understanding of possession, of exorcism, and of the delicate balance between human vulnerability and divine intervention. And yet, even here in Greece, the struggle is evident. To host the sacred is to risk the self, and to confront the invisible is to confront the limits of understanding, identity, and mortality itself. Rome, healing priests, and the rituals of the Larvae. In the sprawling plains and crowded hills of Italy, where the Tiber wound its way past villages and through the growing city of Rome, humanity began to encounter the spiritual in a way that was at once practical, civic, and profoundly personal. Unlike the Egyptians, who focused on the architecture of the soul, and the Ka and Ba, or the Greeks, who explored possession as language and divine communication, the Romans approached the unseen with a sense of order, hierarchy, and ritualized intervention. They built an empire not only of stone and law, but of spiritual mechanisms designed to safeguard the living from forces that could intrude upon mind, body, and community. Central to Roman spiritual protection were the priests known as fediales, augurs, and specialized healing priests, whose duties extended far beyond the ceremonial. The Roman understanding of possession, haunting, and spiritual intrusion was intricately linked to health, both individual and communal, and to the maintenance of social order. Spirits were not abstract forces. They were active participants in the life of the city, capable of influencing events, illness, misfortune, and even the outcome of wars. Protecting against these forces required a system that combined observation, ritual, and practical intervention. One of the most compelling and fearsome threats recognized by the Romans was the Larvae, restless spirits of the dead who had not received proper burial rites or who had suffered unjust deaths. These spirits were believed to wander the boundaries of the living world, seeking to return to it, often with intent to harm. They were not malevolent simply because of inherent nature. They were driven by unfinished business, by the disruption of social and cosmic order. A larva could cause illness, madness, accidents, or even political turmoil. And because Rome was a civilization deeply invested in law, hierarchy, and order, the presence of such a spirit represented both a personal danger and a threat to civic stability. To address the intrusion of larvae, the Romans developed a series of highly structured rituals. Exorcism was not a casual practice, but a deliberate, codified art. The priests might perform sacrifices, incantations, purifications, and legalized appeals to the gods, invoking the divine to compel the restless spirits to return to their proper place. Certain rites involved gestures, symbols, and vocalizations meant to identify the particular nature of the spirit and to negotiate with it, offering appeasement, acknowledgement, or correction. Just as in Mesopotamia and Egypt, the spoken word carried authority. But in Rome, words were intertwined with the law of the city, the hierarchy of gods, and the expectation of civic responsibility. Healing priests, in particular, began to be the intermediaries between body and spirit, recognizing that illness could result from the intrusion of unseen forces. Fever, delirium, convulsions, or sudden mental disturbance were not only medical phenomena, but signs that a spirit might be present or that cosmic balance had been disrupted. Temples dedicated to gods such as Aesculapius, the god of healing, became centers of spiritual and physical recovery. Pilgrims arrived with offerings, prayers, and ailments, seeking remedies that combined the physiological and the mystical. Sleep, incubation, and ritualized observation were common, as the patient was placed in a sacred space, often in the temple itself, to allow for divine communication and the restoration of health. The Romans also formalized the use of amulets, protective inscriptions, and domestic rituals. Homes were consecrated to ward off spirits, with boundaries marked by gestures and charms, thresholds guarded by representations of powerful deities, and offerings maintained to appease any spirits who might wander too close. The line between personal, domestic, and civic spiritual responsibility was fluid. Every citizen had a role in maintaining the proper order, ensuring that the living remained protected from the restless dead and other invisible agents. Funerary practices were particularly important. Burial rites, offerings, and commemorative rituals were meticulously observed because the failure to honor the dead properly could result in the creation of larvae. Graves were consecrated, funerary texts sometimes inscribed, and family members performed repeated ceremonies to maintain alignment between the worlds of the living and the dead. In this sense, exorcism was not solely a reactive practice. It was preventive, integrated into the rhythm of daily, familial, and civic life. Unlike the Egyptians, whose focus was on the complex interplay of the ka and bia, the Romans approached spiritual intrusion with a structured pragmatism. They catalogued risks, assigned specialists, and established rituals that could be repeated with authority and consistency. Yet, within this order, there remained an acknowledgement of unpredictability. Even the most precise rite could fail if the spirit's nature was misidentified, if the ritual sequence was imperfect, or if the human participants failed to respect the invisible hierarchy. In this, the Roman approach maintained a delicate balance between confidence and humility, between mastery and reverence. Public spaces were also subject to ritual oversight. Temples, marketplaces, aqueducts, and military camps were regularly purified and blessed to prevent the intrusion of malevolent forces. Divination, augury, and observation of omens were not mere superstition. They were methods to detect the presence of unseen agents and to mitigate their influence before harm could occur. Every act of governance, every military campaign, and every public festival included attention to spiritual balance, as Rome recognized that social cohesion was inseparable from metaphysical order. The rituals surrounding Larvae also demonstrate the Romans' sophisticated understanding of psychology and human perception. Individuals experiencing possession might be guided through ceremonies designed to restore their agency, reintegrate them into social and spiritual life, and re-establish their connection to both community and the divine. The exorcist was at once healer, mediator, and interpreter, translating the language of the spirit for human comprehension, and vice versa. Here, we see an evolution from the Mesopotamian reliance on codified incantations and the Egyptian emphasis on protecting the components of the soul. The Romans integrated social, legal, and therapeutic dimensions, recognizing that spiritual disturbance could manifest in mind, body, and community simultaneously. The Romans also inherited and adapted ideas from their Greek predecessors. Dionysian possession, ecstatic prophecy, and oracular insight were understood, translated, and codified to fit Roman civic and religious expectations. The Greeks had emphasized dialogue with the divine. The Romans emphasized negotiation and enforcement, creating a framework in which spirits, while potentially dangerous, could be persuaded, compelled, or redirected through precise ritual, legalized appeals to the gods, and structured human intervention. In this way, the Romans expanded the understanding of exorcism from a personal or domestic concern into a civic, medical, and legal phenomenon. Possession and spiritual intrusion were no longer anomalies. They were events to be anticipated, interpreted, and managed within a system that connected the human, the divine, and the social. The rituals surrounding the larvae exemplify this integration, demonstrating that exorcism could be simultaneously defensive, restorative, and preventive, a reflection of Rome's larger philosophy, that life, in all its dimensions, could be governed by structure, observation, and ritual. Here, in the crowded streets of the city, in the shadows of temples and tombs, and in the quiet of homes and sanctuaries, humanity confronted the reality of the unseen with a combination of fear, discipline, and ingenuity. The spirit world was ever present, capable of harm and influence, yet approachable through knowledge, ritual, and mediation. The human being, in turn, became a participant in a broader order, learning to navigate the thresholds between life and death, body and spirit, community and cosmos. And so, in Rome, the art of exorcism reached a new stage of complexity. The practitioners were no longer simply priests, shamans, or isolated specialists. They were civic custodians, healers, interpreters, and enforcers of both spiritual and social order. The unseen, while unpredictable, was acknowledged, addressed, and negotiated with. Possession, intrusion, and unrest became phenomena that could be managed with knowledge, ritual precision, and moral authority. It is here, amid the aqueducts, forums, and temples, that the relationship between human, spirit, and society crystallizes in a form that would influence Western thought for centuries. The Romans demonstrated that spiritual defense is not merely an individual concern, nor merely a matter of fear, but a complex system connecting law, medicine, ritual, and community. In this system, the human soul, body, and mind were simultaneously protected, interpreted, and integrated into a network of cosmic and civic responsibility. India's Vedic hymns, chanting as spiritual surgery. In the vast plains and river valleys of ancient India, where the Ganges flowed slowly under the weight of early sun, and the forests and mountains whispered with the lives of countless creatures, humanity began to articulate an understanding of the unseen that was intricate, expansive, and profoundly intimate. Here, the practice of exorcism, of spiritual defense, was woven into the very fabric of ritual, philosophy, and daily life. It was a civilization in which sound itself, when precise and properly aligned, became a tool of intervention, a scalpel of the invisible, capable of excising illness, banishing malevolent forces, and restoring balance to the mind, body, and cosmos. The foundation of this approach lay in the Vedic tradition, which predates most other known codifications of spiritual practice. The Vedas, hymns, chants, and ritual texts, were considered not merely instructive, but alive with power. Each syllable, each intonation, carried the potential to alter reality itself, to shape the unseen in ways that were both subtle and transformative. Here, sound was not metaphor, it was causative. Words, when chanted according to the strictures of meter, pitch, and rhythm, could influence spirits, the health of the living, and the order of the universe. In this context, illness, mental disturbance, misfortune, or unexplained suffering was often interpreted as the result of imbalance, whether caused by spirit intrusion, misaligned energies, or the missteps of ritual neglect. Vedic priests, trained in the precise pronunciation, rhythm, and intonation of sacred chants, acted as mediators and surgeons of the invisible. Their work was painstaking and exacting. A single mispronounced syllable, a lapse in timing, or an improperly prepared offering could render a ritual ineffective, or worse, invite further spiritual disruption. The underlying principle of Vedic exorcism was that the universe, the human body, and the unseen forces that inhabit it were interconnected in a dynamic, harmonious system. To heal one element or to protect a person from malevolent influence, the practitioner addressed sound, vibration, rhythm, and intent simultaneously. The chants were often accompanied by offerings of clarified butter, sacred fires, and carefully arranged ritual implements, all calibrated to harmonize the energies of the participants, the gods, and the spirit world. One of the most profound aspects of these rituals was the belief that spiritual intrusion could be surgically removed or redirected. Illness caused by hostile spirits or misaligned energies was not simply tolerated or feared. It could be precisely targeted. A chant, when correctly delivered, could disrupt the hold of a demon, drive away a restless spirit, or restore equilibrium to the affected individual. In this sense, the act of exorcism was akin to surgery, delicate, exacting, and performed with deep knowledge of both anatomy and cosmology. Vedic exorcism was not merely performed in temples or sacred groves. It permeated domestic life, communal ceremonies, and seasonal festivals. Families maintained ritual practices designed to protect the home and its members from intrusion. Offerings of food, water, and flowers were made to deities and to the spirits of ancestors, ensuring their favor and discouraging unrest. Mantras, both spoken and meditated upon, acted as protective shields, and their repetition became a form of sustained defense against forces that might otherwise overwhelm human vulnerability. The philosophical underpinnings of this system were profound. The Vedas present a vision of the cosmos in which sound, intention, and ritual action are inseparable from the material world. Humans are embedded within a network of forces, both seen and unseen, and every act of thought, speech, and ritual resonates throughout this network. Possession, or spiritual disruption, then, is not an aberration, but a signal of imbalance, a call to restore harmony through precise, intentional, and knowledgeable intervention. Priests trained in this art were repositories of both theoretical and practical wisdom. They memorized vast corpora of hymns, understood the subtle effects of vibration on the human body and mind, and could discern the nature of the intruding force, whether a restless spirit, a demon, or an errant energy, through careful observation, inquiry, and divination. Their methods were methodical yet adaptable. Every ritual was calibrated to the individual, the circumstance, and the precise nature of the disturbance. The ethical dimension of this practice was also significant. Vedic practitioners recognized that spiritual intervention was not merely a technical skill. It required moral clarity, self-discipline, and alignment with Dharma, the cosmic law. A priest's own mind and conduct had to be in harmony with the forces they sought to influence. Any personal impurity, doubt, or imbalance could compromise the ritual. This integration of ethics, skill, and ritual precision elevated the work of exorcism from a defensive act to a disciplined spiritual practice, reflecting a holistic understanding of human vulnerability and cosmic order. Chanting, in this context, was simultaneously protective, restorative, and transformative. The human voice became a conduit of divine power, a vehicle through which the practitioner could intervene directly in the processes of life, health, and spiritual integrity. Patients, too, participated. Their presence, intention, and adherence to ritual guidance amplified the efficacy of the chants. Exorcism, therefore, was collaborative, linking practitioner, patient, and cosmos in a delicate interplay of energy, sound, and ritual. As centuries passed, these practices laid the foundation for later spiritual systems in South Asia, influencing not only ritual and medicine, but also meditation, yoga, and broader philosophical understandings of consciousness. The principle remained constant. Precise sound, intention, and ritual action could protect, heal, and restore the human being. Spirit intrusion was real, tangible, and addressable through skill, knowledge, and disciplined practice. Here, in the early Vedic period, we see an evolution of exorcism as both science and art. Possession and spiritual disturbance were neither solely external threats nor purely internal phenomena. They were conditions that could be approached systematically, with knowledge, ritual, and ethical discipline. The human body, mind, and soul were instruments of intervention, capable of hosting, resisting, and interacting with forces far beyond ordinary perception. In India, exorcism became an intimate interplay between sound and structure, between vibration and intention, between cosmic law and human responsibility. Illness, misfortune, and spiritual intrusion were met not with fear alone, but with deeply disciplined, methodical, and morally grounded practice. The human being was recognized as a complex network of energies, susceptible to disruption yet capable of restoration through skillful action. The Vedic hymns, in their precision and power, demonstrate that words themselves can be instruments of healing, protection, and exorcism. This was a civilization in which speech could sever the bonds of intrusion, align energies, and restore balance to the body and soul. Here, sound became the surgical tool of the spirit world, a scalpel wielded with care, knowledge, and profound respect for the unseen forces that touch every human life. Buddhist monks and the idea of illusion as exorcism. Across the mountains, valleys, and forests of ancient India, and into the lands that would come to be called Tibet, China, and Southeast Asia, a new understanding of the human mind and its relation to the unseen began to emerge. In these regions, the practice of exorcism evolved in subtle but profound ways, not centered exclusively on external spirits, restless dead, or malevolent intrusions, but on the nature of illusion, perception, and the mind itself. Buddhist monks, following the teachings of the Buddha, approached the unseen not merely as a threat to be expelled, but as a reflection of the mind's tendency towards suffering, attachment, and delusion. In this understanding, the art of exorcism became deeply intertwined with meditation, awareness, and the cultivation of insight. Buddhism teaches that the world as experienced by ordinary consciousness is permeated by Maya, or illusion. This is not illusion in the sense of simple trickery, but the fundamental misperception of reality, the identification of self with impermanent forms, the projection of fear, desire, or anger onto the world, and the attribution of permanence or intrinsic power to phenomena that are transient, conditional, and interdependent. Within this framework, many conditions that had previously been interpreted as possession, spiritual intrusion, or malevolent influence were understood as manifestations of attachment, ignorance, or distorted perception. Buddhist monks approached the exorcism of these forces not with fire, sound, or ritual precision alone, but through mindful observation, disciplined meditation, and ethical living. A person suffering from what might appear as spirit possession, intense fear, erratic behavior, compulsive thoughts, or hallucinations, was guided to observe the arising of these experiences without clinging or aversion. The practitioner learned to perceive these phenomena as temporary, impermanent, and not inherently threatening, and in doing so, the grip of what had seemed external was gradually dissolved. Ritual remained important, but it was recontextualized. Mantras, incense, chanting, and visualizations were tools not merely to expel or compel spirits, but to transform perception and align the mind with deeper truths. A mantra spoken with mindfulness was a method of focusing the mind, creating an internal order that reflected the external cosmos. The visualization of protective deities, wrathful or compassionate, served as a mirror for the practitioner's own inner strengths and capacities, illustrating that the real battle was not with an external force alone, but with the tendencies of fear, attachment, and delusion within oneself. Monks trained extensively in discernment. They observed subtle signs in behavior, speech, and thought, recognizing patterns that might indicate psychological disturbance, karmic imbalance, or genuine spiritual intrusion. In many cases, what had been labeled as a demon, a spirit, or an external possessor was understood as a projection of unresolved karma, latent tendencies, or disrupted energy within the mind and body. The monk's role, therefore, was not simply to confront an external entity, but to guide the individual toward clarity, understanding, and liberation from misperception. Temples and monastic communities functioned as both centers of meditation and of healing. Those seeking assistance were not passive recipients, but participants in a practice of self-observation, reflection, and disciplined attention. Exorcism became inseparable from instruction in mindfulness, to recognize fear, anger, and delusion as impermanent, to observe the arising and passing of thoughts without identification, and to cultivate compassion and ethical action as a natural shield against the influence of both inner and outer disturbance. Buddhist texts describe methods that might, to an outside observer, appear as ritual exorcism, ceremonies involving chanting of sutras, circumambulation of stupas, consecration of sacred objects, and the use of protective symbols or mandalas. These were not intended solely to force spirits away through coercion, as in earlier civilizations, but to reorient perception, to remind the practitioner of the impermanence and interdependence of all phenomena, and to provide a framework within which fear and confusion could be transformed into clarity and composure. The ethical and philosophical dimensions were inseparable from the practical. Compassion, non-harming, and right conduct were understood as essential to maintaining the mind's clarity and stability. A monk who engaged in ritual without mindfulness, who attempted to exorcise others without understanding their own attachments and delusions, risked exacerbating confusion rather than alleviating it. The act of exorcism, therefore, was as much a training in ethical and cognitive discipline as it was a spiritual intervention. Buddhist exorcism also emphasized community and relational balance. Monks and lay practitioners worked together to support those experiencing disturbances, recognizing that isolation, misunderstanding, or neglect could amplify misperception and suffering. Healing rituals often involved collective participation, creating a network of attention, intention, and care that stabilized both the individual and the broader social environment. In some traditions, protective deities or wrathful figures were invoked, not as coercive agents, but as embodiments of qualities the practitioner sought to cultivate within themselves: courage, insight, vigilance, and discernment. Confronting a demon in ritual was a mirror of confronting one's own tendencies toward anger, attachment, or fear. The externalized ritual served as a guide for internal transformation, illustrating that the true exorcism occurs when the mind perceives reality clearly, free from the distortions that give rise to suffering. Buddhist monks also integrated these insights into broader practices of health and healing. Meditation, breath control, dietary discipline, and ethical conduct were considered essential to maintaining the stability and resilience of the mind and body. Disturbances that might have been attributed to possession or spirit intrusion in other cultures were often addressed holistically, combining ritual, observation, and internal cultivation. The goal was not merely to remove the influence of an external force, but to create the conditions in which the mind, body, and spirit could operate with clarity, balance, and insight. This approach marks a profound evolution in the understanding of spiritual disturbance. Whereas earlier civilizations emphasized defense against spirits or the codification of protective rituals, Buddhist practice shifted focus toward the inner landscape of perception itself, recognizing that clarity, mindfulness, and ethical discipline form the ultimate shield against intrusion. Possession, in this paradigm, becomes a manifestation of misunderstanding, attachment, or misperception. An exorcism becomes an act of education, guidance, and alignment rather than coercion. Through this lens, the human being is not simply a vessel under attack, nor a battlefield between external forces. Instead, the person is an awareness capable of observation, reflection, and transformation. Spirits, demons, and intrusive influences are understood as phenomena that arise within perception, and their power is contingent upon misunderstanding, fear, and misalignment. The Buddhist monk, therefore, becomes both healer and teacher, guiding the individual to recognize the impermanent and interdependent nature of experience and to reclaim agency over mind and body. Here, in monasteries and sacred groves, beside rivers and mountaintops, the art of exorcism becomes an exercise in insight. The mind is trained to perceive clearly, the spirit is guided to stability, and suffering is alleviated through a combination of observation, ritual, and disciplined ethical practice. Illusion itself is treated as the primary adversary, and through this understanding, what might appear as possession, intrusion, or malevolent influence is transformed into opportunity, education, and liberation. The Buddhist approach represents a turning point in the history of exorcism. It shifts emphasis from external confrontation to internal mastery, from coercion to guidance, from fear to understanding. Possession is recognized as both real and illusory, as a reflection of the mind's vulnerabilities and the potential for transformation. In this system, the unseen world is not denied, ignored, or combated through force alone. It is observed, interpreted, and engaged with through insight, awareness, and disciplined practice. And so, across mountains, valleys, and rivers, the human encounter with unseen forces takes on a new dimension. Exorcism is no longer solely an act of defense. It is an act of understanding, training, and liberation. The human being is both vessel and observer, capable of perceiving, engaging, and ultimately transforming the forces that arise within and without. Here, Buddhist monks demonstrate that the most profound exorcism may not be the expulsion of spirits, but the illumination of the mind, the dissolution of delusion, and the cultivation of clarity in the face of the unseen. Shinto purification, cleansing the invisible unseen. Across the islands of Japan, where mist clings to mountainsides and rivers carve delicate paths through bamboo groves, the human understanding of spirits and unseen forces took on a uniquely intimate and pervasive character. Unlike earlier civilizations, where the unseen was often approached as a threat to be expelled or a message to be deciphered, in Shinto, the indigenous spiritual tradition of Japan, the unseen permeates every corner of the natural world, interweaving with daily life, community, and the very landscape itself. Here, exorcism is inseparable from purification, and spiritual practice is inseparable from ordinary existence. The Japanese word for this cleansing, harai, encompasses the removal of impurity, pollution, and imbalance, reflecting a vision in which human life is in constant negotiation with the invisible forces surrounding it. In Shinto belief, spirits, or kami, are not inherently malevolent. They are the expressions of natural phenomena, ancestors, and cosmic forces. Yet just as rivers flood, winds howl, or fire consumes, these forces can become disruptive when harmony is disturbed. Illness, misfortune, or mental disturbance may indicate that a barrier between human activity and the natural spiritual order has been breached. To restore balance, practitioners engage in purification rituals designed to cleanse both the body and the environment, to realign intention, and to repair the invisible threads connecting humans with the world around them. Shinto purification rituals take many forms, from simple acts of washing hands and rinsing the mouth at the entrance to a shrine, to complex ceremonies conducted by priests called kanushi, or ritual specialists known as miko. Central to these rituals is the understanding that purity and impurity are not moral judgments, but states of relational harmony. Dirt, illness, emotional turmoil, or social transgression are all forms of impurity, disruptions that can disturb the flow of spiritual and natural energy. The act of purification, therefore, is not an act of exorcising evil in the sense of battle, but an act of restoration, a gentle yet deliberate realignment of the human with the unseen order. Among the most iconic tools of Shinto exorcism and purification is the onusa, a wooden wand adorned with strips of white paper, used to cleanse people, spaces, and objects of disruptive spiritual energy. In the hands of a priest, the onusa is waved rhythmically over the person or object, accompanied by recitation, clapping, or invocation, in a process that is at once physical, auditory, and symbolic. The practitioner does not command or banish a spirit in a confrontational sense. Rather, they restore harmony, clear pathways for flow, and re-establish alignment between human intention and cosmic order. Water plays a particularly significant role in Shinto purification. Rivers, waterfalls, and the ocean are seen as conduits of cleansing energy, capable of washing away the impurities that accumulate within the body, mind, and environment. The act of standing beneath a waterfall, or misogi, is a ritual that immerses the practitioner in both literal and symbolic purification. The physical immersion is accompanied by breathing exercises, chanting, and mental focus, creating a synchronized alignment of body, mind, and spirit. In this way, the Shinto approach recognizes that the unseen is not an enemy to be fought, but a network of forces to be harmonized with, and that spiritual intervention is as much about attunement and receptivity as it is about defense. Shinto ritual also emphasizes seasonal cycles and communal participation. Festivals, or matsuri, often include purification ceremonies that cleanse entire communities, shrines, and landscapes. Offerings of rice, sake, or other symbolic items are made to the kami, not as bribes or coercion, but as acknowledgements of interdependence and respect. The rituals ensure that natural and human systems continue to flow in alignment, preventing disruptions that might manifest as illness, misfortune, or perceived spiritual intrusion. In this sense, Shinto exorcism is both personal and social, connecting the individual to family, village, and the natural world in a continuous web of observance and responsibility. Perhaps most profound is the understanding that the unseen in Shinto is everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. A tree, a rock, the wind across a valley, or the curve of a river may all harbor spiritual energy. Human action, thought, and intention influence these forces, and conversely, these forces influence human life. Illness, conflict, or misfortune are signals that some aspect of this relationship has become imbalanced. The role of purification, then, is not simply to remove a malevolent entity, but to restore flow, alignment, and equilibrium across multiple layers of existence: personal, environmental, social, and cosmic. Priests and ritual specialists are trained in the subtleties of observation, timing, and ceremonial procedure. The power of purification is not located in coercion or force, but in precision, presence, and understanding. The way the onisou is waved, the placement of offerings, the rhythm of chants and clapping, the orientation of participants, all are calibrated to facilitate the natural alignment of energies. In Shinto practice, the human is both a receiver and a participant, capable of influencing spiritual harmony through attention, intention, and respectful engagement. Shinto exorcism and purification are also inseparable from ethical conduct. Living in alignment with social and cosmic norms reduces the accumulation of impurity, prevents spiritual disturbances, and strengthens the resilience of mind and body. Ritual alone is insufficient. Harmony requires mindfulness, attentiveness, and respect for the cycles of nature and human interaction. Here, exorcism is as much about preventing intrusion through ethical and spiritual cultivation as it is about addressing existing imbalance. The Shinto approach demonstrates a striking sophistication. It recognizes that unseen forces are not adversaries to be destroyed, nor puzzles to be deciphered, but conditions to be harmonized. Spiritual intrusion is understood as a symptom of disharmony, whether in the body, mind, or environment. And the role of ritual is to re-establish equilibrium in a manner that is gentle, precise, and relational. This emphasis on harmony, attunement, and restoration distinguishes Shinto from earlier civilizations, while also contributing to a continuum of human strategies for understanding and engaging with the unseen. Within temples, forests, riversides, and homes, the practice of exorcism through purification becomes a subtle art. Every gesture, breath, and offering matters. Every chant, clap, or splash of water contributes to the careful orchestration of balance. Spirits, whether perceived as malevolent, restless, or neutral, are engaged with respect, and human action is calibrated to facilitate their proper place within the world. Illness, misfortune, and misalignment are addressed not with confrontation alone, but with ritualized attention, presence, and care, restoring equilibrium across multiple planes of existence. Through Shinto practice, the history of exorcism expands beyond simple expulsion or defense into a continuum of relational engagement with the unseen, emphasizing prevention, attunement, and restoration. Possession, spiritual disturbance, or misfortune are signals rather than punishments, prompts to observe, reflect, and realign. The human being is neither passive nor merely reactive. They are an active participant in a vast network of energy, influence, and interdependence, capable of cultivating alignment through disciplined action, ethical conduct, and ritual attention. In this landscape of mountains, rivers, and sacred groves, the unseen is acknowledged in every action and every breath. Shinto purification demonstrates that exorcism need not be violent or combative to be effective. It is precise, relational, and continuous, addressing the causes of imbalance in a holistic manner. In this practice, the human is never alone. They are part of a living, breathing network of visible and invisible forces, and spiritual harmony is achieved through care, attentiveness, and deliberate action that bridges body, mind, community, and cosmos. Here, in the islands of Japan, exorcism becomes not merely a response to intrusion, but a way of life, a continuous practice of attunement, respect, and purification. Illness, disturbance, and imbalance are understood, addressed, and harmonized through ritual, intention, and alignment with both human and spiritual networks. The Shinto tradition reveals a profound insight that the unseen is inseparable from daily life, and that true exorcism is an ongoing process of cleansing, restoring, and participating in the flow of the world itself. Ancient Africa, drums, trance, and community spirit work. Across the vast and varied landscapes of ancient Africa, from the verdant rainforests of the Congo Basin to the expansive savannas of the Sahel, the human relationship with the unseen took on a rhythm that was communal, visceral, and profoundly integrative. Here, exorcism and spiritual protection were not only matters of individual concern, but were deeply embedded in the life of the community, the cycles of nature, and the heartbeat of the earth itself. Spirit work in Africa was, above all, a performative, participatory, and sensory practice, a blending of music, movement, trance, and ritual that connected individuals, families, clans, and entire villages to both visible and invisible forces. At the heart of African exorcism was the understanding that spirits, whether benevolent or malevolent, were active participants in daily life. Ancestors watched over the living, guiding, protecting, and sometimes testing them. Malevolent forces could enter through jealousy, envy, illness, or the breaking of social norms. Spirits could attach themselves to individuals, causing emotional turbulence, physical illness, or behavioral disruption. And the restoration of balance required intervention that was both technical and relational. Unlike in some civilizations where exorcism could be performed by a single priest or specialist, in many African cultures, the work was deeply communal, involving musicians, dancers, elders, and participants in a coordinated effort to restore harmony. Drums were among the most essential instruments of spiritual work. The drumbeat was not simply rhythm, it was the pulse of the cosmos, a bridge between the human and spirit worlds. Certain rhythms were believed to attract, repel, or negotiate with spirits. The sound of the drum could induce trance states, opening the individual to communication with ancestors, spirit guides, or even the forces of nature. In trance, the individual might speak, move, or act in ways that were interpreted as direct interaction with the unseen, offering insight, healing, or exorcism. In this way, the line between ritual, healing, and possession was fluid. To enter a trance was to step into a space where the human and spirit worlds intersected. Spirit work often began with observation, divination, and careful listening to the rhythms of both body and community. Elders and ritual specialists, who had trained for decades in the arts of healing, trance induction, and ancestral communication, identified the nature of the spiritual disturbance. They observed symptoms in the affected individual: fever, nightmares, erratic behavior, or emotional instability, and interpreted these as signs of imbalance. Diagnosis was holistic, taking into account personal history, social relations, environmental factors, and spiritual alignments. Healing, then, was not about isolating an individual from their community or environment, but about restoring equilibrium within the broader social and spiritual network. During ceremonies, participants would gather in circles, forming a dynamic web of energy, attention, and intention. The drumming would begin slowly, building in intensity, and the dancers would move in patterns that mirrored cosmic order, seasons, or ancestral narratives. The affected individual, guided by the rhythm and the elders, would often enter a trance state, during which they might communicate with spirits, release blocked energies, or symbolically confront the forces that disturbed their balance. Chanting, singing, and call and response vocals enhanced the experience, creating layers of sound that resonated with both body and spirit. In these moments, exorcism was not an act of violence, but a performance of restoration, a co-created ritual in which the human, the spirit, and the community participated simultaneously. Herbs, sacred objects, and symbolic gestures complemented the auditory and kinetic elements of the ritual. Certain plants were believed to have protective properties, capable of expelling harmful spirits or cleansing the body and environment. Water, smoke, or earth might be incorporated to enhance purification. The practitioner's knowledge of these materials was extensive, passed down orally through generations, and often intertwined with mythology, cosmology, and local history. The combination of sound, movement, and natural elements created a multidimensional intervention, addressing both tangible and invisible sources of disturbance. Community participation was crucial. African societies understood that spiritual imbalance could ripple outward, affecting families, neighbors, and the environment. Exorcism, therefore, was rarely private. It was a shared act of care, attention, and responsibility, reinforcing social cohesion as it addressed individual distress. The process itself was educative, demonstrating the interconnectedness of human behavior, social harmony, and spiritual balance. By participating, individuals learned to maintain relationships, respect ancestral guidance, and live in accordance with communal and natural laws. In many regions, the concept of possession was intimately tied to ancestral guidance and karmic responsibility. Spirits might attach themselves to a person to deliver messages, warn of danger, or correct behaviors. In this context, exorcism was not only about removing the spirit, but about interpreting its purpose, negotiating its presence, and restoring the proper flow of communication between the living and the dead. Trance states allowed for this dialogue, enabling the practitioner and community to discern the intentions of the spirit and respond appropriately. The rhythms of African exorcism reflect a profound understanding of human psychology and somatic experience. Trance, induced through sound and movement, allowed the individual to externalize inner turmoil, confront fear, and release blockages that might manifest as illness, anxiety, or behavioral disturbance. In this sense, spirit work functioned as therapy, performance, and cosmological alignment simultaneously, addressing the unseen forces as they were understood, while also providing a framework for internal regulation and community restoration. Importantly, African spirit work maintained flexibility and adaptability. Each ritual was tailored to the context, the individual, and the community. Practitioners recognized that no single pattern of exorcism could address every disturbance. The drumbeat, the song, the herbs, the dances, and the gestures were calibrated to the specifics of the situation, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of both human experience and spiritual ecology. The unseen world was approached not as an enemy, but as a system of relationships, dynamic, powerful, and responsive to careful, knowledgeable engagement. Across centuries and regions, this approach has persisted, influencing both local and diasporic spiritual practices. The use of rhythm, trance, and community-based interventions highlights a continuity in human strategy for negotiating the unseen. The recognition that the human body, mind, and spirit are inseparable from social and environmental networks, and that spiritual disturbance is best addressed through multisensory, participatory, and relational means. In ancient Africa, the unseen was never distant. It was felt in the heartbeat of drums, seen in the movement of dancers, heard in the call and response of singers, and sensed in the attentiveness of the community. Exorcism was both an art and a science, integrating rhythm, perception, and communal energy into a practice that healed, restored, and harmonized. The human being was not merely a passive vessel. They were an active participant, an agent of alignment, and a receiver of guidance from both ancestors and cosmic forces. Through this lens, spirit work in Africa exemplifies an approach to exorcism that is holistic, participatory, and deeply connected to the rhythms of life itself. Illness, misfortune, and spiritual disturbance are addressed not with fear alone, but with coordinated action, ethical engagement, and sensory attunement. The practice underscores the understanding that humans exist within a web of influence, both visible and invisible, and that restoration requires attention to the body, mind, community, and spirit simultaneously. Here, in villages, forests, and open plains, the drums beat, the dancers move, and the voices rise, weaving a network of care, communication, and balance. Spirits are acknowledged, guided, and harmonized. Disturbances are addressed not in isolation, but in connection with a living, breathing, and responsive social and spiritual ecosystem. Ancient African exorcism reminds us that the unseen is neither distant nor abstract, and that human ingenuity, rhythm, and relationality can cultivate harmony even in the presence of forces beyond ordinary perception. Jesus and the Moment exorcism becomes a global story. In the arid hills and dusty plains of 1st century Judea, along the winding paths between Galilee and Jerusalem, a man arose whose engagement with the unseen would mark a profound turning point in the history of exorcism. Jesus of Nazareth, a carpenter turned itinerant teacher and healer, approached spiritual disturbance with a combination of authority, compassion, and profound insight that would resonate across centuries, cultures, and continents. In his time, possession and demonic influence were understood both in religious and social terms, and his exorcisms were not merely personal acts of healing, but declarations about the relationship between humanity, the divine, and the unseen forces that inhabited the world. Jesus' approach was distinctive in its immediacy and authority. Unlike earlier traditions, where ritual, incantation, or careful ceremony mediated the interaction with spirits, he confronted disturbances directly, often without recourse to ritual paraphernalia, extensive preparation, or complex incantations. His words, his presence, and the force of his intent were sufficient. In one moment, he would encounter a man writhing, screaming, or isolated from the community. In the next, he would speak, and the spirit would depart. This immediacy was revolutionary. It demonstrated a conviction that spiritual intrusion was not only detectable and confrontable, but could be addressed through moral and divine authority embodied in a human being. Accounts describe a variety of possessions, individuals exhibiting sudden strength, uncontrollable speech, convulsions, or behaviors that alienated them from family and society. In this world, demonic possession was often interpreted as both a spiritual condition and a social crisis. Those afflicted were marginalized, feared, or isolated, their suffering magnified by misunderstanding and stigma. Jesus' exorcisms, in contrast, were acts of integration. He restored the afflicted to health, dignity, and community, signaling that the unseen forces, while real and formidable, were ultimately subject to alignment with divine intention. The settings of these interventions were varied. Some occurred in crowded villages, where curious neighbors gathered to witness the events and to participate in the communal recognition of healing. Others took place in remote spaces, deserts, hillsides, and isolated homes, where the human, the spiritual, and the divine intersected in intimate and immediate ways. In all cases, Jesus emphasized both personal transformation and social reintegration, demonstrating that spiritual disturbance was not solely a private matter, but one that affected families, neighbors, and community structures. His exorcisms were marked by dialogue and discernment. Accounts often describe him asking the possessing spirit for its name, for its origin, or for its intent. The act of naming, of speaking directly to the unseen, reflects a continuity with earlier traditions. Mesopotamian incantations, Egyptian appeals, and Shinto rituals all recognize that acknowledgement and precise identification of the spiritual agent are crucial for effective intervention. Yet Jesus' method was remarkable in its immediacy and authority. Where previous systems relied on intermediary specialists, he acted as the direct conduit of divine power, asserting a sovereignty that blurred the lines between human, priest, and divine agent. The significance of these actions extended beyond the personal. In the context of 1st century Judea, possession and spiritual disturbance were intertwined with conceptions of religious law, social cohesion, and moral order. By exercising authority over spirits, Jesus asserted a new framework in which the divine could operate directly through human agency. Healing the possessed was therefore both a restoration of individual health and a demonstration of the breaking in of divine authority into the human world, signaling a shift in the cosmic order and a redefinition of what it meant to live in alignment with God. Moreover, Jesus' exorcisms were often accompanied by broader teachings. He framed these acts within narratives about compassion, repentance, and the transformation of the self. Possession was not simply an external invasion. It was a signpost, revealing human vulnerability, the presence of imbalance, and the necessity of aligning with ethical and spiritual truths. Healing the afflicted was inseparable from teaching communities about faith, responsibility, and moral alignment, linking spiritual intervention with broader human development and social responsibility. The methods themselves, while appearing simple, were nuanced. Authority was conveyed through voice, gesture, and presence. Silence, gaze, and positioning played roles alongside words of command or invocation. In some instances, the spirit is described as convulsing, speaking through the afflicted, or resisting before ultimately departing, all emphasizing the real and tangible nature of the encounter, while also highlighting the need for discernment, courage, and alignment with higher authority. Each act was both a demonstration of spiritual power and a lesson in ethical engagement with unseen forces. Jesus' exorcisms also had symbolic weight. They represented a shift in perception about the nature of spiritual authority, suggesting that intervention was not the exclusive domain of ritual specialists, priests, or temple functionaries. Divine power, aligned with compassion and ethical clarity, could operate directly through human action. This accessibility democratized the practice, illustrating that spiritual disturbance could be addressed through alignment with divine will rather than solely through codified ritual or hierarchical mediation. These acts of exorcism spread rapidly in both narrative and influence. Followers witnessed, recounted, and eventually codified stories of healings and spirit expulsions, embedding them within the broader teachings of the early Christian movement. In doing so, exorcism became part of a globalizing narrative, moving beyond the confines of local custom to enter the consciousness of multiple cultures across time. It was no longer simply a local response to spiritual intrusion. It became emblematic of a worldview in which divine presence, human moral agency, and unseen forces were dynamically interconnected. The communal aspect of these exorcisms was equally significant. Witnessing the healing of one individual reinforced the cohesion of the broader group, underscoring the interdependence of personal health, spiritual alignment, and social harmony. The stories of possession and healing became teachings for communities about responsibility, care, and vigilance, suggesting that spiritual disturbance could reflect broader social or moral imbalance. The exorcism was therefore a tool not only for restoring individuals, but for educating, guiding, and harmonizing entire communities. Through Jesus, exorcism enters the historical record as both a spiritual practice and a narrative vehicle, illustrating the interplay between human agency, divine authority, and the unseen. Possession was understood as real, disruptive, and dangerous, yet it was also comprehensible, addressable, and above all, subject to moral and spiritual intervention. Healing and exorcism were inseparable from teachings about compassion, discernment, and ethical living, demonstrating that spiritual work was not isolated, but deeply woven into human relationships, community life, and cosmic alignment. Here, in the hills and towns of Judea, exorcism transitions from a local or regional practice to a global narrative of spiritual authority and human transformation. The actions of Jesus redefine engagement with the unseen. They combine immediacy, authority, compassion, and instruction, and they frame spiritual disturbance as both a personal and communal phenomenon. In this moment, exorcism becomes more than ritual. It becomes a story, a teaching, and a transformative act whose influence will echo far beyond the boundaries of first-century Palestine, reverberating across cultures and centuries, shaping the human understanding of spirit, authority, and the profound potential of human-divine collaboration. Early Christianity, holy water, and the weaponization of prayer. As the teachings of Jesus spread across the Mediterranean world, the fledgling Christian communities faced the task of interpreting, codifying, and expanding the spiritual authority he demonstrated in exorcisms. In the first centuries following his life, exorcism became a formalized aspect of Christian practice, yet it also evolved to reflect the complex interplay of theology, ritual innovation, and community formation. The unseen was understood as a real and present force, capable of inflicting harm, inducing illness, and disrupting both personal and communal harmony. In response, the early church developed techniques that combined symbolic, material, and verbal elements, laying the groundwork for centuries of Christian spiritual warfare, and in doing so, created a system in which prayer itself could be wielded as a weapon. Central to this period was the use of holy water, a medium that symbolized both purification and divine protection. Water, long associated with cleansing in multiple cultures, took on a uniquely Christian character. Blessed by priests, it was no longer mere liquid. It became a tangible conduit of divine power, capable of repelling demons, purifying spaces, and shielding the faithful from spiritual harm. The act of sprinkling or anointing with holy water combined tactile experience with spiritual intent, allowing believers to interact with the unseen world in a way that was at once physical and mystical. Churches were routinely sanctified with holy water, and households often maintained small vessels for personal use, reflecting an understanding that spiritual protection was both communal and individual, embedded in the rhythms of daily life. Prayer became equally instrumental, weaponized not in the sense of aggression, but in the sense of targeted spiritual intervention. Exorcism prayers were formalized, repeated, and codified in texts that circulated among bishops, priests, and monastic communities. These prayers often invoked the names of Christ, the Virgin Mary, angels, and saints, drawing on the authority of the divine hierarchy to confront, command, and expel malevolent forces. The language of these prayers was precise, sometimes formulaic, and always intentional. Every word, cadence, and gesture carried weight. Early Christian theologians believed that demons could be coerced or compelled by the proper invocation of divine authority, that the power of spoken words, imbued with faith and ritual precision, could disrupt the grip of spiritual forces over human beings. The early church also distinguished between various types of possession and spiritual disturbance. Some individuals were believed to be afflicted by minor, temporary influences, while others suffered from deep, entrenched spiritual attachment that required extended intervention. Bishops, deacons, and later specially trained exorcists were called upon to assess, diagnose, and treat these disturbances with a combination of prayer, fasting, ritual, and community involvement. Exorcism was understood as a ministry of both the divine and the church, emphasizing the interconnectedness of authority, ritual knowledge, and spiritual alignment. Beyond individual healing, early Christian exorcisms often functioned as performative acts of communal teaching and reinforcement of faith. When a possessed individual was healed, witnesses were reminded of the power of God, the reality of unseen forces, and the necessity of moral and spiritual vigilance. The ritual reinforced community cohesion, ethical conduct, and doctrinal adherence, illustrating that exorcism was not only a personal intervention, but also a social and pedagogical tool. The interplay between individual and communal restoration became a defining feature of early Christian exorcism, shaping the Church's understanding of spiritual authority and responsibility. Sacred objects, in addition to prayer and water, played a significant role in these interventions. Crosses, relics, and icons were deployed as focal points of divine presence, their physicality serving as a bridge between the material and the spiritual. The presence of a relic, touched, held, or placed near the afflicted, was believed to concentrate spiritual power, drawing protection and facilitating the expulsion of malign forces. In some cases, these objects were carried in processions, blessing entire neighborhoods or towns, reflecting a belief that spiritual influence could be extended outward through symbolic, tangible means. Fasting and ascetic practice were also integrated into early exorcism. Clerics and practitioners understood that spiritual authority required personal discipline, moral clarity, and purification of the body and mind. A priest or exorcist would often engage in extended periods of prayer, abstinence, and ritual preparation before performing an exorcism, ensuring that their own spiritual alignment was sufficient to wield the authority of Christ against malign forces. This highlights a critical aspect of early Christian practice. The effectiveness of exorcism depended not solely on ritual form, but on the ethical, spiritual, and moral integrity of the practitioner. Another significant development was the formalization of rites of exorcism in early Christian liturgy. Texts such as the Rituale Romanum, though later codified, have roots in these centuries of practice, preserving prayers, instructions, and procedural guidelines that allowed clergy to confront possession in standardized ways. The codification reflects both the Church's growing understanding of spiritual disturbance and its desire to maintain doctrinal control over ritual authority, ensuring that exorcism remained a legitimate and regulated form of spiritual intervention. These rites incorporated both verbal command and material symbols, water, oil, gestures, emphasizing that spiritual power is both spoken and embodied. The ethical dimension of early Christian exorcism was ever present. Exorcists were expected to act with compassion, discernment, and restraint. The goal was not spectacle, domination, or entertainment, but restoration, to return the afflicted to health, reintegrate them into the community, and affirm the authority of God over all unseen forces. Misuse of the practice could be dangerous, both spiritually and socially, reflecting a recognition that spiritual power requires both knowledge and virtue. The intertwining of authority, morality, and ritual efficacy demonstrates that early Christian exorcism was a complex, sophisticated system, balancing theology, ethics, and practical intervention. This period also saw the Church engage in a subtle form of intellectual exorcism, in which doctrinal teaching itself became a weapon against spiritual disturbance. Catechesis, moral instruction, and the cultivation of faith were understood as prophylactic measures. Individuals nurtured in prayer, virtue, and belief were less vulnerable to spiritual intrusion. Exorcism was therefore not only reactive but preventative, emphasizing that the unseen could be negotiated and countered through education, devotion, and disciplined spiritual practice. By combining prayer, holy water, sacred objects, fasting, ritual gesture, and communal reinforcement, early Christianity transformed exorcism from a localized, improvised intervention into a codified, repeatable, and morally grounded practice, capable of addressing individual disturbance while reinforcing community and doctrine. Possession, spiritual imbalance, and unseen influence were real, dangerous, and pervasive. Yet the Church offered a system in which these forces could be confronted, understood, and mitigated through a careful combination of faith, ritual precision, and moral integrity. In this way, early Christianity weaponized prayer not in the sense of aggression toward others, but as a precise instrument for aligning human, communal, and divine will against forces that disrupted balance. Holy water, relics, chants, gestures, fasting, and ethical preparation together created a multi-layered defense against possession and spiritual harm, establishing a model of intervention that would influence centuries of exorcists, clerics, and believers. Through these practices, exorcism became both a means of restoration and an assertion of divine order, shaping the early Christian understanding of the unseen, the moral responsibilities of the faithful, and the ways in which human action could participate in the broader cosmic struggle between order and chaos. Early Christianity, therefore, codified the act of confronting spiritual disturbance into a system that was theological, ritualistic, and profoundly human, laying the foundation for the global spread of exorcism as both a practice and a narrative. Islamic Ruqyah, the Quran as sonic armor. Across the deserts, oases, and bustling cities of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, a new understanding of spiritual protection and exorcism emerged alongside the rise of Islam. In this context, unseen forces were recognized as real, potent, and capable of influencing human health, behavior, and fortune. Jinn, malevolent spirits, envy, and other unseen disturbances were acknowledged as part of the cosmic order. Yet Islam provided a framework through which these forces could be confronted, mediated, and neutralized. Central to this practice was Ruqyah, the use of the Quran, supplications, and specific ritual procedures to safeguard individuals and cleanse them of harmful spiritual influence, establishing what might be described as the sonic armor of the believer. Ruqyah is rooted in the belief that the divine word carries intrinsic power, that the act of recitation, pronunciation, and listening aligns the human soul with God's authority, and that this alignment is sufficient to repel or expel harmful unseen forces. Unlike practices that relied heavily on material implements, dance, or rhythm, Ruqyah emphasizes vocalization, resonance, and divine invocation. A practitioner reads or chants passages from the Quran, often accompanied by supplications, dua, intending to invoke God's protection, purity, and order. The words themselves are considered sacred, alive with meaning and divine force, capable of penetrating both the physical and spiritual layers of existence to confront disruption directly. The efficacy of Ruqyah lies in its multidimensional approach. First, it addresses the afflicted individual's spiritual alignment. By reciting divine words, the practitioner creates an environment in which the unseen must reckon with the authority of God. Second, it acts on the individual's mind and body, as the rhythmic, melodic recitation produces physical resonance, calm, and heightened focus. The repetition of sacred phrases, combined with the attentive presence of the practitioner, fosters a state in which fear, agitation, and disturbance are gradually supplanted by alignment, concentration, and a sense of divine presence. Finally, Ruqyah is socially and communally anchored. In many traditions, family members, neighbors, or spiritual guides participate, reinforcing the intervention through collective attention and shared faith. Jinn, the entities most commonly addressed in Ruqyah, are understood as creatures made of smokeless fire, capable of possessing, influencing, or subtly manipulating humans. They exist in a parallel dimension to humans, interacting with the material world according to divine decree, but also through their own will. Possession by a jinn could manifest as sudden illness, erratic behavior, obsessive thoughts, or disturbances in relationships. Unlike demons in some other traditions, jinn are not inherently evil. They are morally ambiguous, and their influence can be either benevolent or malevolent. Exorcism through Ruqyah, therefore, requires discernment, knowledge of scripture, and careful application of divine authority. The methods of Ruqyah vary depending on tradition, but common practices include reciting specific surahs, chapters of the Quran, such as Al-Fatiha, Al-Baqarah, or Al-Ikhlas, sometimes over water that is then drunk or used to wash the affected person. Salt, olive oil, or other items may be blessed through recitation and applied to the body, creating a layered interaction between spoken word, physical medium, and personal intention. Each element amplifies the protective effect, producing an environment in which the spiritual disruption cannot maintain influence. In this way, Ruqyah operates simultaneously on multiple planes: verbal, physical, psychological, and spiritual. Ethical and moral preparation is critical for both practitioner and patient. Fasting, prayer, purification, and adherence to religious law ensure that the practitioner's intention is aligned with divine will and that the affected person is receptive to spiritual intervention. Ruqyah is not undertaken lightly. It is understood that unseen forces may react to improper handling, insincerity, or neglect. The process demands discipline, faith, and meticulous adherence to sacred procedure, reflecting the broader Islamic principle that spiritual efficacy is inseparable from moral and ethical alignment. Historically, Ruqyah was practiced in homes, mosques, and private spaces, often adapted to local cultural norms while maintaining strict fidelity to Quranic authority. The practice became widespread not only because of its efficacy, but also because it was accessible. Recitation required no elaborate instruments, no specialized incantations outside scripture, and could be performed by anyone trained in the proper understanding of the Quran. This accessibility facilitated the integration of spiritual protection into daily life, allowing communities to maintain continuity between faith, ritual, and the unseen forces that influenced health, fortune, and social order. Ruqyah also emphasizes the inseparability of spiritual and physical health. Affliction by a jinn or other unseen force is often addressed not only through recitation, but through concurrent attention to bodily care, diet, and social support. Healing is thus holistic. It acknowledges that human well-being encompasses mind, body, and spirit, and that intervention must address all these levels to be complete. The recited word becomes a vehicle for alignment, the body a receptive vessel, and the community a reinforcing structure that magnifies the protective effect. One of the most remarkable aspects of Islamic exorcism is its use of sound as both weapon and shield. The human voice, guided by divine authority, becomes a resonant force capable of both confrontation and restoration. The recitation of the Quran produces vibrations that are believed to penetrate both the material and spiritual dimensions, destabilizing negative influences while reinforcing protective energy. Listening, repeating, or chanting these verses aligns the listener with divine order, creating a sonic barrier that shields the soul from intrusion. In this sense, Ruqyah exemplifies a sophisticated understanding of sound as both medicine and armor, capable of reshaping perception, restoring balance, and mediating the unseen. Ruqyah is also deeply relational. While the practitioner carries the authority to perform the intervention, the affected individual participates actively, often responding to recitation, repeating verses, or receiving physical applications such as blessed water. Families, neighbors, and spiritual guides often witness or participate, reinforcing social cohesion and ensuring that the individual's reintegration into the community is smooth and spiritually reinforced. Exorcism, in this sense, is both a personal restoration and a communal affirmation, blending individual healing with collective responsibility. Over centuries, Ruqyah has adapted to local cultures, incorporated diverse methods of recitation, and responded to new understandings of illness and spiritual disturbance. Yet its core principle remains. The divine word is both shield and weapon. By aligning the human, the spoken, and the unseen with God's authority, Ruqyah exemplifies a model of spiritual intervention in which sound, intention, and ethical alignment converge to restore balance. Possession, illness, or malevolent influence is met not with violence, but with disciplined attention, sacred resonance, and moral authority, producing a system of exorcism that is both profoundly effective and enduringly elegant. In the deserts, cities, and villages of the Islamic world, Ruqyah continues to demonstrate that the unseen is neither abstract nor irrelevant. Spiritual forces are active, impactful, and real, yet they are subject to the alignment of human intention with divine authority. The Quran, in its recitation, becomes both guide and weapon, its sound vibrating across body, mind, and spirit, creating a space in which balance is restored, disturbance is mitigated, and the human being is shielded against the ever-present influence of unseen forces. In this tradition, exorcism is inseparable from faith, ritual, ethics, and community, illustrating that spiritual protection is most effective when it is sacred, disciplined, and harmonized with the divine order. Medieval Europe, when demons become medical diagnosis. In the shadowed corridors of medieval Europe, between the flickering light of candlelit monasteries and the bustling, dirt-laden streets of towns and villages, the unseen world took on an ever more intricate and at times terrifying significance. Spiritual disturbance, possession, and illness were increasingly understood as intertwined, and the boundary between medical affliction and demonic intrusion became porous and uncertain. In this period, the act of exorcism evolved alongside medicine, theology, and social governance, producing a reality in which the diagnosis of a demon could be as commonplace as the diagnosis of fever, while spiritual intervention became entangled with both medical and ecclesiastical authority. The medieval European worldview was profoundly shaped by the conviction that unseen forces constantly influenced human life. Illness could not be fully separated from spirit. Mental disorder could indicate demonic presence. Misfortune could be interpreted as divine punishment or spiritual interference. Clerics and healers alike navigated a landscape in which the spiritual and physical were inseparable, where the cause of disease might reside in the body, the soul, or the invisible world that hovered around both. Physicians, often trained in the Galenic tradition of humors, would sometimes incorporate spiritual assessment alongside physical examination, while clergy were called upon to discern whether an ailment was medical, demonic, or a combination of both. Exorcism became formalized as a critical tool within this system. In monasteries and cathedrals, priests trained in the rites of the church would undertake interventions that combined ritual, prayer, and sacramental use with observation of symptoms, gestures, and behavior. The possessed might exhibit convulsions, speaking in tongues, unusual strength, or periods of deep silence and withdrawal. These behaviors were interpreted as evidence of a spiritual presence taking hold, yet at the same time, they were meticulously observed for patterns that could align with naturalistic explanations. In this era, the healer and the priest were often one and the same, their authority drawn from both divine sanction and learned observation. The early medieval church codified specific rites to guide the process of exorcism, providing texts, prayers, and ritual gestures that standardized practice across regions. Holy water, incense, crucifixes, and sacred oil were employed alongside verbal command, invoking the names of Christ, saints, and angels. The ritual space itself was carefully managed. A church, chapel, or consecrated room offered not only symbolic power, but a controlled environment in which the priest could exercise authority, and the afflicted could be observed and guided. The boundaries of space, the timing of recitation, and the placement of participants were all understood as critical to the success of the exorcism, reflecting a sophisticated grasp of both psychological and spiritual dynamics. The role of community was also central. Unlike earlier individualistic or shamanic practices, medieval exorcism was a highly social endeavor. Neighbors, family members, and witnesses often observed the process, reinforcing communal norms and providing support to both the afflicted and the practitioner. Public exorcisms could serve as moral exemplars, warning against sin, impiety, or moral transgression, while private exorcisms sought to restore individuals to health and social functionality. In this context, Spiritual intervention was never solely about the individual. It was a mechanism for social cohesion, moral reinforcement, and communal reassurance. Yet in this period, exorcism was also intimately connected to emerging medical theory. Physicians increasingly attempted to correlate symptoms of possession with imbalances of the humors, epilepsy, or psychological disturbance. Melancholia, hysteria, and mania could be interpreted as demonic influence, and conversely, possession could manifest alongside fever, delirium, or other physiological symptoms. This convergence of medicine and exorcism produced a unique hybrid, a recognition that the unseen could influence the visible, that spiritual intervention could produce physical healing, and that careful observation could distinguish between affliction, moral failing, or spiritual interference. In some ways, this blending reflects an early acknowledgement of psychosomatic reality, a recognition that body and soul are inseparable, and that unseen forces could act through, or be revealed by, physical manifestation. The medieval mind also constructed a moral and cosmological framework around possession. Demons were understood not simply as malicious, but as moral actors, capable of punishing sin, exploiting weakness, or testing faith. The exorcist's authority, therefore, was both spiritual and ethical. Mastery over the unseen required not only knowledge of ritual, but also personal virtue, steadfast faith, and moral clarity. An exorcist who was impure, distracted, or insufficiently disciplined risked failure, or worse, aggravating the spiritual disturbance. In this sense, medieval exorcism was not simply a technical procedure. It was a rigorous practice demanding concentration, moral integrity, and an alignment with divine principles. Literary and historical accounts from this period illustrate the complex interplay of fear, belief, and observation. Chronicles recount individuals writhing, speaking in foreign tongues, or displaying prodigious strength, while clerics documented every gesture, word, and symptom. Physicians might record pulse, temperature, and behavioral patterns alongside accounts of spiritual activity, producing an astonishingly detailed record of both observed reality and interpreted spiritual causation. The meticulous observation of these cases contributed to a proto-scientific understanding of human behavior, even as it was inseparably entwined with theological interpretation. The use of sacramentals, particularly holy water, and blessed objects, became a defining feature of exorcism in this era. Holy water was sprinkled, used to anoint the afflicted, or employed to cleanse spaces in which spiritual disturbance was suspected. Relics, crosses, and images of saints were strategically positioned, creating a layered field of protection that extended across both physical and spiritual dimensions. Prayer and incantation were repeated with careful attention to rhythm, phrasing, and duration, reinforcing the authority of the practitioner and asserting the primacy of divine order over chaos and malevolent force. Exorcism in medieval Europe also intersected with social control. The recognition of possession could validate the authority of religious institutions, reinforce communal norms, and channel fear into structured ritual. At the same time, it reflected genuine concern for the afflicted, blending compassion, observation, and intervention in a culture that recognized the pervasive influence of unseen forces on daily life. Possession, illness, and misfortune were often interpreted as interconnected symptoms of a broader cosmic and moral order. An exorcism became a means of navigating and restoring balance within that order. Over time, the perception of demons and possession became more codified, with manuals, treatises, and theological commentaries guiding practitioners. These texts delineated symptoms, identified appropriate prayers, and described ritual gestures, contributing to the professionalization of exorcism as a specialized practice. Yet even as techniques became standardized, the unpredictability of the unseen remained central. Each case required discernment, attentiveness, and ethical calibration. ensuring that medieval exorcism remained both a technical and profoundly human endeavor. In the flickering candlelight of chapels and the echoing nave of cathedrals, exorcism became a practice that bridged spiritual authority, emerging medical observation, communal responsibility, and moral instruction. It was both a response to unseen forces and a reflection of the intricate ways in which medieval Europeans understood health, sin, and cosmic balance. Demons, illness, and possession were real threats, yet they were addressed through ritualized attention, sacramental intervention, and the disciplined authority of clergy who navigated the porous boundary between body and spirit, disease and malevolence, observation and faith. Medieval Europe demonstrates that exorcism is not only a spiritual practice, but a reflection of cultural, medical, and social systems. Spiritual disturbance is inseparable from human observation, moral concern, and ethical intervention. And the act of exorcism becomes a nexus where theology, medicine, and communal life converge. In this period, demons were diagnosed, prayer weaponized, and ritual codified, creating a legacy in which the unseen was neither ignored nor abstract, but confronted with precision, care, and a blend of spiritual and empirical reasoning that shaped the trajectory of exorcism for centuries to come. Witch trials and the Age of Fear as mass possession. As Europe emerged from the medieval period and entered the fraught centuries of the early modern era, the interplay between fear, faith, and the unseen intensified to unprecedented levels. The social, political, and religious upheavals of the 15th through 17th centuries created an environment in which the unseen was not only acknowledged but actively feared, and the notion of possession expanded from individual affliction to a phenomenon that could envelop entire communities. During this period, belief in witchcraft, demonic influence, and mass possession became intertwined with legal systems, ecclesiastical authority, and popular imagination, producing one of the most dramatic, terrifying, and tragic chapters in the history of spiritual disturbance. The witch trials were not isolated incidents of superstition. They were the culmination of centuries of thought about the unseen, possession, and moral authority. Communities were primed to interpret misfortune, illness, crop failure, and social discord as signs of malevolent spiritual intervention. Demons, previously understood as agents acting primarily on the afflicted individual, were now imagined to work through human intermediaries, witches, whose actions threatened not only bodies and minds, but the very fabric of society. The afflicted, often young girls or individuals displaying extraordinary behavior, were interpreted as victims of mass spiritual influence, while accusations of witchcraft extended the invisible battle into public social and legal domains. Exorcism and interrogation were deeply intertwined in this era. Possession, whether of an individual or a group, often served as both evidence and catalyst for the identification of supposed witches. Clerics, inquisitors, and magistrates approached the afflicted with a combination of ritual, prayer, and forensic questioning. Observations of convulsions, trances, or speaking in unusual tongues were interpreted as signs of external demonic influence, which then implicated individuals in the community as agents or collaborators of these forces. In many ways, the distinction between victim and perpetrator became blurred as the unseen was projected outward, creating an environment of suspicion, fear, and moral panic. The rituals of exorcism in this period were dramatic and multifaceted. Priests and religious specialists employed prayers, holy water, sacramentals, fasting, and invocations of saints to confront the spirits believed to be acting through the afflicted. In some cases, these rituals were public, performed in church halls or civic spaces, demonstrating communal authority over the unseen and asserting the power of divine order. In others, exorcisms were private, conducted in homes or sacred chambers, emphasizing personal restoration and spiritual cleansing. Yet the underlying assumption remained constant. Possession was real, dangerous, and detectable. An intervention required both spiritual authority and communal vigilance. At the same time, medical and psychological understanding remained limited. Convulsions, hallucinations, or behaviors now attributed to possession could have been the result of epilepsy, hysteria, malnutrition, or trauma. Yet the explanatory framework was overwhelmingly spiritual. The presence of unseen forces offered a coherent narrative in a world of uncertainty, allowing communities to interpret suffering, misfortune, and deviance through the lens of moral and cosmic order. In this sense, exorcism and witch trials were simultaneously spiritual, social, and quasi-medical practices designed to restore balance and enforce conformity. Fear itself became a potent multiplier. Accounts of mass possession, particularly among groups of young women in villages or convents, reveal a phenomenon in which suggestion, anxiety, and social pressure combined with belief to produce physical manifestations of affliction. Convulsions, screaming, trances, and fits of unusual strength could spread through groups like contagion, interpreted as genuine supernatural interference. Exorcism, then, was not only a means of confronting spirits, but also a mechanism for managing mass anxiety, channeling fear into structured ritual, and reinforcing both ecclesiastical and civic authority. The legal dimension of witch trials further complicated the landscape. The presence of possession could serve as evidence of witchcraft, and the accused was subjected to interrogation, often under extreme duress. Confessions, whether coerced or voluntarily given, were interpreted as confirmation of demonic collaboration. Here, the unseen exerted influence through social and judicial structures, demonstrating that belief in possession could have tangible, sometimes fatal, consequences. Exorcism, in this context, was inseparable from policing morality, adjudicating social norms, and asserting institutional power. Despite the fear and violence, these practices reveal an ongoing attempt to comprehend and navigate the unseen. Exorcists, inquisitors, and clergy worked with meticulous attention to detail, observing behavior, testing spiritual boundaries, and applying ritual in ways intended to restore balance. Prayer, sacred words, gestures, and material objects were deployed with care, reflecting a belief that spiritual forces could be constrained, negotiated with, or expelled, but only through precise application of authority and observant discernment. Community participation remained critical. Public exorcisms were not merely spectacles. They were ritualized affirmations of collective moral and spiritual order, teaching populations about the dangers of sin, the presence of evil, and the necessity of vigilance. Through these rites, the unseen became both tangible and socially regulated, its influence managed not solely by the individual, but by the combined authority of clergy, magistrates, and the observing community. The intensity of fear during this period, combined with the widespread belief in spiritual contagion, created conditions in which exorcism and accusation could spiral outward. Groups of individuals, sometimes entire villages, were treated as sites of spiritual disturbance, and the act of intervention became both a protective and punitive measure. Mass exorcisms were conducted, prayers recited, and rituals performed to purge entire communities of imagined malevolent influence, reflecting the scaling of exorcism from personal healing to collective spiritual warfare. Despite the terror, the era also demonstrates the ingenuity and persistence of human spiritual practice. Exorcism, prayer, and ritual were adapted to manage the anxieties of the age, provide frameworks for understanding suffering, and reinforce social cohesion in a period of profound instability. Holy words, gestures, water, and sacramentals became tools not only for spiritual intervention, but for shaping perception, mediating fear, and creating a sense of order in a world rife with uncertainty and invisible threats. The witch trials, therefore, reveal a turning point in the history of exorcism, a period in which the unseen was feared collectively, in which possession could become mass phenomena, and in which ritual, law, and communal observation intersected to manage both human behavior and spiritual threat. In this era, exorcism was no longer solely a practice of restoration for the afflicted individual. It became a mechanism for controlling communities, reinforcing moral norms, and asserting authority over the unseen and the imaginable alike. Here, in villages, towns, and ecclesiastical courts across Europe, exorcism was elevated to a societal instrument. It reflected deep anxieties about human frailty, moral deviation, and spiritual intrusion, and it intertwined the individual, the collective, and the cosmic in ways that were both profound and terrifying. The age of fear as mass possession underscores the extraordinary capacity of belief to shape experience, behavior, and social order, demonstrating that exorcism can be as much about human psychology, politics, and culture as about spirits themselves. The Enlightenment, when science tried to replace spirits. As Europe moved into the 17th and 18th centuries, the Age of Reason began to reshape the ways in which humanity understood the world, including the unseen, spiritual disturbances, and the phenomena previously attributed to possession or demonic influence. The Enlightenment brought a profound shift in perception. The invisible forces that had once terrified communities and prompted elaborate rituals were increasingly interpreted through the lens of observation, experimentation, and rational analysis. Exorcism, long a central practice of spiritual and communal life, faced a challenge. Could human suffering, mental disturbance, and unusual behavior be explained without recourse to spirits, demons, or unseen moral agents? This period marks the beginning of a collision between spiritual tradition and emerging science, a time in which reason, skepticism, and empiricism began to challenge the long-standing authority of ritualized exorcism. Medical theory advanced rapidly during this era, with physicians and natural philosophers seeking to explain previously inexplicable phenomena in terms of bodily imbalance, neurological irregularity, and environmental factors. Epilepsy, hysteria, melancholy, and convulsive disorders, once firmly understood as signs of possession or demonic influence, were increasingly reinterpreted as natural conditions with physiological causes. The Enlightenment encouraged systematic observation, classification, and documentation, and practitioners began to distinguish between genuine spiritual disturbance and behaviors that could be traced to natural causes. In doing so, the authority of the exorcist, once largely unquestioned, came under scrutiny, and spiritual intervention was often supplemented or replaced by medical investigation. Despite this emerging rationalism, the transition was neither immediate nor absolute. In many communities, centuries of belief in spirits, possession, and spiritual contagion persisted, particularly among populations that remained closely tied to religious life or traditional ritual. Clerics and healers continued to practice exorcism, sometimes blending empirical observation with ritual, producing a hybrid model in which faith and reason coexisted uneasily. A physician might examine a patient for physical or neurological symptoms, while a priest simultaneously invoked prayer, holy water, or sacramentals, reflecting a pragmatic recognition that spiritual belief could influence outcomes, even as it was increasingly questioned. Rational thinkers of the Enlightenment, however, began to document possession and exorcism in more systematic ways, producing treatises, essays, and case studies that sought to explain these phenomena in terms of human psychology, social conditioning, and suggestibility. Figures such as Johann Weyer argued that supposed witches and possessed individuals were not instruments of supernatural evil, but victims of mental illness, delusion, or social pressure. This approach reframed exorcism as a diagnostic tool for understanding human behavior, even as it undermined the theological foundations upon which traditional ritual depended. The intellectual climate of the Enlightenment also encouraged skepticism toward collective hysteria and moral panic. Communities that had once accepted mass possession as evidence of spiritual danger now encountered voices suggesting that fear itself could produce the manifestations of affliction. Convulsions, trances, and erratic speech were no longer automatically attributed to spirits. They were seen as natural reactions to stress, suggestion, or illness. Yet even as rationalism grew, the symbolic and psychological function of exorcism persisted. Ritual, prayer, and moral intervention continued to serve as mechanisms for social cohesion, reassurance, and moral teaching, demonstrating that belief and ritual could maintain influence independent of empirical validation. During this era, the tools of exorcism were increasingly reinterpreted or adapted. Holy water, incantation, and prayer were sometimes applied as psychological support rather than strictly spiritual intervention, functioning to calm the mind, reassure the afflicted, and reinforce moral and social norms. Sacred gestures and sacramentals became part of an early understanding of mind-body interaction, anticipating later concepts in psychology and psychosomatic medicine. The act of ritual, once understood solely as a confrontation with unseen forces, was now also recognized as capable of producing measurable effects on human perception, emotional state, and social interaction. The Enlightenment also saw the rise of formal institutions for the care of those previously considered possessed. Asylums, hospitals, and clinics began to provide structured environments in which individuals with behavioral or neurological disturbances could be observed, treated, and reintegrated into society. Spiritual interpretation was often retained in parallel with medical observation, creating a dual framework in which the unseen was neither entirely denied nor fully relied upon, but increasingly mediated through reason, discipline, and structured care. In these spaces, exorcism was reframed as therapeutic intervention, a ritualized yet rationalized response to human suffering that acknowledged the power of belief while introducing empirical oversight. Even as reason advanced, Enlightenment thought did not entirely eradicate belief in spiritual interference. Demonology, witchcraft, and possession remained culturally resonant, and stories of exorcism continued to captivate the imagination. The period illustrates the tension between enduring belief and emerging knowledge, revealing that spiritual interpretation is not easily supplanted by reason alone. Rather, it shows that human beings have long sought to navigate the boundary between visible and invisible forces, and that ritual, narrative, and moral framework continue to shape responses to fear, disorder, and affliction. The Enlightenment, therefore, represents a turning point in the history of exorcism, a moment in which science began to offer alternative explanations for what had once been understood solely as the work of spirits, yet a moment in which ritual, moral authority, and communal practice continued to exert influence. The authority of the exorcist was challenged, yet not entirely replaced, as reason and faith existed side by side, producing new hybrid practices and understandings. Spiritual intervention became a complement to observation and analysis, and exorcism was increasingly recognized as both symbolic and practical, psychological and spiritual, capable of addressing fear, restoring order, and reinforcing ethical norms, even as its theological foundations were questioned. In the libraries, salons, and laboratories of the Enlightenment, thinkers debated the nature of possession, the reality of spirits, and the boundaries of human understanding. Case studies, treatises, and reports attempted to classify, rationalize, and predict human behavior in ways that displaced purely spiritual explanations. Yet the resonance of centuries of belief could not be erased. Exorcism, once an uncontested confrontation with the unseen, was now an intersection of faith, reason, observation, and social ethics, demonstrating the enduring human need to confront disorder, restore balance, and navigate the unknown. Thus, the Enlightenment reveals both the power of reason and the persistence of the unseen in human consciousness. Spirits, possession, and the act of exorcism did not disappear. They were reinterpreted, integrated into emerging knowledge systems and transformed into a space where ritual, morality, and empirical observation intersected. The unseen was challenged, questioned, and analyzed. Yet the fundamental human concerns that had always underpinned exorcism, fear, vulnerability, moral alignment, and the need for restoration, remained as relevant and urgent as ever. 19th century spiritualism, séances, and the return of the dead. The 19th century opened a new chapter in humanity's relationship with the unseen, a period marked by industrial expansion, scientific innovation, and profound social transformation. Against this backdrop, a phenomenon emerged that blurred the boundaries between life and death, spirit and matter, and the rational and the mystical: spiritualism. Unlike earlier eras, in which exorcism sought to expel unseen forces from the living, spiritualism offered the possibility of communication with the dead, presenting an entirely new framework for understanding possession, influence, and the persistence of the unseen in human affairs. Séances, mediums, and spirit communication became widespread, captivating the imagination of urban and rural populations alike, and transforming both private practice and public discourse. At the heart of spiritualism was the belief that the departed retained consciousness and could interact with the living through intermediaries known as mediums. These individuals, often revered for their sensitivity to spiritual currents, were believed capable of perceiving, interpreting, and channeling messages from spirits who had passed beyond the material world. The séances they conducted were ritualized gatherings in which the living, seated around tables in dimly lit parlors, or beneath flickering candlelight, sought evidence of presence from the unseen. Knocks, raps, materializations, automatic writing, and trance speech were interpreted as signs that spirits had returned, their voices reaching across the boundary of life and death. Unlike earlier forms of exorcism, which focused on expulsion and protection, spiritualism emphasized dialogue and reception. The unseen was no longer necessarily malevolent or disruptive. Spirits could offer guidance, reassurance, or prophecy. Yet the potential for danger remained, as untrained or malevolent spirits were thought to interfere, mislead, or induce obsession in the living. The role of the medium, therefore, was both sacred and precarious. They served as a bridge between worlds, maintaining ethical and spiritual alignment to ensure that communication remained safe, accurate, and beneficial. In this sense, the practice of spiritualism can be seen as a form of exorcism, inverted. Instead of casting out the unseen, practitioners sought to invite, discern, and negotiate with it. The popularity of spiritualism in the 19th century was fueled by widespread cultural anxieties. The rapid social changes of industrialization, the aftermath of war, and the frequent death of children and young adults produced collective grief and a hunger for reassurance that life, consciousness, and personal bonds persisted beyond death. Séances offered a socially sanctioned space in which these anxieties could be confronted, structured, and mediated. In drawing the living and the dead together, spiritualism provided a form of psychological exorcism, releasing grief, articulating moral frameworks, and offering explanations for suffering and loss. Communities engaged in this practice not only to witness supernatural phenomena, but also to reinforce belief systems, ethical norms, and emotional resilience. Mediumship itself was a rigorous practice. Individuals reported entering altered states of consciousness, during which they experienced visions, heard voices, or produced automatic writing believed to originate from the spirit world. These altered states required preparation, fasting, meditation, ethical discipline, and careful attention to the spiritual environment. Just as in earlier exorcism traditions, the practitioner's moral, emotional, and spiritual integrity was believed to directly affect outcomes. A medium in poor alignment could misinterpret, miscommunicate, or even attract harmful entities, demonstrating that spiritual sensitivity required both skill and virtue. Scientific interest in spiritualism further complicated the landscape. Prominent figures, including psychologists, philosophers, and even physicists, sought to study the phenomenon through observation, experimentation, and documentation. Séances were attended by investigators eager to measure knocks, record automatic writing, or witness materializations. The intersection of spiritualism and science highlighted the continuing tension between rationalism and belief in the unseen. Whereas Enlightenment thinkers had sought to replace spirits with physiological or psychological explanations, spiritualism embraced the unseen as a real, persistent, and investigable dimension, suggesting that the human experience of spirit could coexist with empirical scrutiny. Séances often incorporated ritual elements that echoed earlier exorcism traditions, demonstrating the enduring influence of centuries of spiritual practice. Candles, circles, prayer, invocation of protective entities, and formalized etiquette ensured that the space was conducive to spiritual interaction. Physical objects, such as tables, writing implements, or pendulums, became focal points for communication, anchoring the unseen in tangible forms. In this way, spiritualism maintained the material-spiritual interplay that characterized exorcism in previous eras. Yet it reoriented the purpose, from expulsion of malevolent forces to facilitation of controlled, ethical contact with the deceased. The psychological dimension of spiritualism cannot be overstated. Participants often reported intense emotional experiences, catharsis, relief, awe, or terror, reflecting the deep human need to engage with mortality, morality, and the unseen. Collective belief, suggestion, and expectation amplified the phenomena, producing convincing experiences of presence even in the absence of external proof. In this sense, spiritualism functioned both as social exorcism and emotional rehearsal, enabling communities and individuals to process grief, ethical dilemmas, and existential anxiety through ritualized engagement with the unseen. Spiritualist thought also challenged the strict boundaries between life and death that had dominated previous centuries. Where exorcism historically drew clear distinctions between the living, the afflicted, and malevolent spirits, spiritualism suggested that consciousness, morality, and influence could persist beyond the grave. This shift had profound implications. The unseen was not merely a threat to repel, but a persistent layer of reality that could be engaged with, interpreted, and learned from. In some respects, it represents a transformative expansion of exorcism, one in which engagement replaces confrontation, and dialogue replaces command. Public fascination with spiritualism intertwined with literature, social gatherings, and even political discourse. Séances were reported in newspapers, investigated by academics, and debated in salons and parliaments. Mediums became public figures, their abilities scrutinized, celebrated, and sometimes vilified. The unseen became both a personal and a societal concern, reflecting the pervasive human desire to understand mortality, morality, and the boundaries of human experience. Exorcism in this era was no longer a private or ecclesiastical matter alone. It became embedded in culture, education, and emerging media, shaping perceptions of the spirit, consciousness, and the ethical responsibilities of the living. The 19th century also highlighted the dangers of engagement with the unseen. Fraudulent mediums, psychological manipulation, and obsession could lead to social disruption, personal harm, and moral panic, illustrating that interaction with the spiritual realm remained fraught with risk. Protective practices, ethical codes, and ritual discipline were emphasized, echoing earlier traditions in which preparation, moral integrity, and observation were central to safe spiritual work. In this sense, spiritualism represents both continuity and innovation. Continuity in the ethical, ritual, and communal dimensions of spiritual practice, and innovation in its approach to the unseen as interlocutor rather than adversary. Ultimately, the 19th century expanded the landscape of human interaction with unseen forces. Séances, mediumship, and spiritualism reframed exorcism from a practice of expulsion to a practice of controlled engagement, providing tools for coping with grief, understanding mortality, and navigating the ethical and emotional dimensions of life and death. It demonstrates that the human need to confront, understand, and negotiate with the unseen persists across eras, reshaping itself according to social, technological, and intellectual context. The return of the dead, mediated through ritual, observation, and moral alignment, reflects the enduring human effort to balance fear, curiosity, and the longing for continuity beyond the boundaries of the known world. The Catholic Rite of 1614, Codifying the Mystery. In the early 17th century, amidst the reverberations of the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, and the turbulent political and religious landscapes of Europe, the Catholic Church undertook a decisive step to formalize, codify, and centralize its approach to spiritual affliction. The publication of the Rituale Romanum, which included the rites of exorcism in 1614. This was a moment of profound significance in the history of exorcism, as centuries of informal, localized, and varied practices were unified under a standardized, ecclesiastically sanctioned framework, reflecting the Church's determination to assert control over the invisible forces that it had long acknowledged, feared, and sought to regulate. The 1614 Rite represented not merely a manual of procedure, it was a theological, moral, and ritual statement, codifying the Church's understanding of the unseen, the human soul, and the mechanisms through which evil might be confronted, resisted, and expelled. Prior to this codification, exorcism had existed in myriad forms across Europe. Clerics, monks, and lay practitioners applied localized rituals, prayers, and sacramentals, drawing upon centuries of accumulated wisdom, folk tradition, and scripture. These practices varied widely, influenced by regional customs, linguistic differences, and the discretion of individual practitioners. Some rituals emphasized strict verbal commands, others incorporated symbolic gestures, holy water, relics, or incense. Yet this diversity, while rich, produced inconsistency, and the Church, seeking to strengthen ecclesiastical authority and ensure doctrinal fidelity, recognized the need for uniformity, precision, and theological clarity. The Catholic Rite of 1614 was the culmination of this effort, producing a text that would serve as both guide and safeguard for priests, ensuring that exorcism was performed in alignment with Church teaching and under the watchful eye of institutional authority. The rite itself is remarkable for its meticulous structure. It begins with prayers of preparation, invoking the name of God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit, calling upon angels and saints as witnesses and protectors. The exorcist is instructed to enter the ritual with humility, discernment, and unwavering faith, recognizing that spiritual authority is not innate, but granted through alignment with divine will and the sanction of the Church. The text carefully delineates the steps for confronting the possessed, commanding spirits to reveal their names, origins, and intentions, and demanding their departure in the name of Christ. Every word, gesture, and sequence is prescribed, reflecting an understanding that spiritual forces operate according to law, order, and hierarchy, and that only precise adherence to sacred procedure can ensure success. One of the critical innovations of the 1614 Rite was its emphasis on discernment and ethical conduct. The exorcist is instructed to carefully assess whether the affliction is truly demonic or the result of natural illness, mental disorder, or moral crisis. This insistence on careful observation and evaluation echoes the Enlightenment's emerging recognition of natural causes, yet it is situated firmly within a spiritual and moral framework. Exorcism is not a mechanical act, it is a moral performance, a confrontation in which the exorcist's faith, virtue, and ethical integrity are as essential as the ritual itself. Improper application, laxity, or arrogance, could provoke the spirit, endanger the afflicted, or undermine the authority of the rite. In this sense, the codified exorcism functions as both spiritual discipline and ethical training, ensuring that power over the unseen is exercised responsibly, reverently, and effectively. The use of sacramentals within the rite was both symbolic and practical. Holy water, blessed oil, the crucifix, and sacred relics were deployed not merely as instruments of faith, but as extensions of divine authority. Each object, infused with prayer and ritual, reinforced the hierarchical relationship between the exorcist, the possessed, and the unseen forces. The placement of these objects, their motion, and their invocation created a structured, sacred space in which the spiritual conflict could unfold according to divine order. The 1614 Rite, therefore, represents a sophisticated understanding of spatial, symbolic, and auditory resonance in ritual practice. The combination of sacred word, physical gesture, and consecrated material produced an environment in which the unseen could be engaged, constrained, and ultimately expelled. Community and oversight were integral to the rite. The exorcist was rarely permitted to act alone. Witnesses, often other clergy, were instructed to observe, record, and support the ritual, ensuring both accountability and efficacy. This procedural rigor reflects the Church's recognition that spiritual engagement, particularly with malevolent forces, is inherently risky and must be conducted within a framework of collective authority and moral supervision. Exorcism, codified in 1614, became a ritual of both individual intervention and institutional affirmation, binding personal spiritual action to the broader structures of church hierarchy. The theological implications of the 1614 codification are profound. By formalizing the rite, the Church articulated a clear understanding of evil, human vulnerability, and divine authority. Demons are real, deliberate, and bound by moral law. The possessed are both victims and participants in a cosmic drama. The exorcist acts as an agent of God, asserting divine law through ritual, prayer, and moral authority. This framework reinforced the Church's claim to mediate between the human and the divine, between the material and the invisible, and between fear and restoration. The rite is as much a theological declaration as a practical guide, demonstrating that exorcism is inseparable from moral, ethical, and spiritual order. Historical accounts from the period reveal the power of the codified rite in practice. Clerics reported extended exorcisms in which the prescribed prayers, gestures, and sacramentals produced dramatic responses. Convulsions, revelations of spirit names, verbal acknowledgement of wrongdoing by demonic agents, and eventual cessation of affliction. Lay observers, witnesses, and the broader community were often drawn into the ritual, reinforcing both the authority of the Church and the perceived reality of spiritual hierarchy. The codification also protected priests from misuse or misapplication, providing clear guidance that mitigated risk and aligned practice with doctrinal orthodoxy. The 1614 Rite also influenced later developments in the Church and beyond. By establishing a standardized protocol, it created a template for training exorcists, documenting cases, and integrating exorcism into broader pastoral care. The principles of observation, moral integrity, and procedural rigor continued to shape the practice of exorcism for centuries, influencing both Catholic and secular understandings of possession, spiritual intervention, and human vulnerability to unseen forces. Even as belief in demonic possession waned in some societies, the intellectual, moral, and ritual frameworks codified in this rite provided a lasting foundation for the ethical engagement with the unseen, demonstrating that structured ritual could channel fear, enforce moral order, and mediate human experience of spiritual realities. In codifying the mystery, the Catholic Church of 1614 achieved a remarkable synthesis. Centuries of diverse exorcism practices were unified into a coherent, disciplined, and theologically grounded system. Spiritual affliction was no longer left to improvisation or local custom. It became a regulated, accountable, and ethically framed practice. The Rite reflects the Church's understanding of the unseen as both real and ordered, dangerous yet constrained, and it asserts that the act of exorcism is simultaneously practical, moral, and sacred, requiring skill, integrity, and alignment with divine authority. Through this codification, the Church ensured that the confrontation with unseen forces would continue in a manner that was both faithful to centuries of tradition and adaptable to the evolving challenges of human experience. Pop culture and The Exorcist. How a film changed faith. The latter half of the 20th century witnessed a profound transformation in the perception and dissemination of exorcism, not through ecclesiastical decree, scholarly treatise, or community ritual, but through the pervasive influence of mass media, popular culture, and most notably, cinema. While exorcism had historically been a ritualized, often private, practice carried out within the boundaries of religious and social authority, the release of William Peter Blatty's novel, The Exorcist, in 1971, followed by William Friedkin's 1973 film adaptation, brought the phenomenon of possession into the global imagination in ways that were unprecedented. This period illustrates how the unseen, once mediated primarily through ritual, scripture, and clerical authority, could be reframed through story, image, and spectacle, reshaping public belief, fear, and engagement with spiritual reality. The Exorcist, both as novel and film, drew upon historical records of possession while interweaving psychological, cultural, and theological elements to create an experience that was at once horrifying, immersive, and deeply compelling. The story of a young girl possessed by a malevolent force, and the priests who undertake her exorcism, resonated on multiple levels. It tapped into centuries of accumulated fear of unseen forces, reflected anxieties about moral and spiritual decay, and explored the tension between faith and modernity. By dramatizing the conflict between human and demonic, innocence and corruption, belief and skepticism, the film transformed exorcism from a ritualized act of ecclesiastical authority into a cultural event experienced by millions simultaneously, accessible not only to those within the Church, but to a global audience spanning diverse religions, cultures, and social strata. The impact of the film on faith and perception was profound. Suddenly, the possibility of possession, the power of ritualized exorcism, and the reality of unseen forces were no longer abstract concepts relegated to scholarly treatises or the secluded work of priests. They became part of mainstream discourse. People who had never witnessed an exorcism, nor even imagined it as a lived possibility, began to consider the unseen as tangible and dangerous. Reports of phenomena resembling possession increased, and priests, psychologists, and spiritual advisors found themselves navigating a new social reality in which the exorcist had blurred the boundary between fiction and perceived truth, influencing belief, fear, and behavior in ways that transcended traditional religious authority. The film's meticulous attention to detail contributed to its enduring effect. Friedkin consulted with Catholic priests, studied historical cases of possession, and incorporated realistic ritual gestures, prayer sequences, and theological language. The exorcism depicted on screen, with its complex choreography of sacramentals, prayer, and ethical tension, reflected centuries of practice codified in the Church, yet adapted for dramatic effect. Audiences, many of whom had little prior exposure to these traditions, were presented with a version of ritual that was both authentic in appearance and heightened for narrative tension. The power of this portrayal lies not only in horror, but in its ability to make centuries of ritual, belief, and spiritual authority visible and visceral for a mass audience. Cultural reactions were immediate and intense. Viewers reported physical reactions, nausea, trembling, fainting, illustrating the potency of suggestion and immersion in the narrative. Scholars, clergy, and psychologists debated the accuracy of the depiction, the ethics of dramatizing such profound spiritual phenomena, and the potential for the film to influence belief in real-world possession. The film sparked renewed interest in exorcism, both as a religious practice and as a cultural symbol, catalyzing discussions about the intersection of faith, psychology, and media. Seminaries saw increased inquiries about training for exorcists. Psychologists and psychiatrists engaged with cases of purported possession, and the public engaged in a broader cultural exploration of fear, morality, and the unseen. The Exorcist also transformed the narrative framework through which society understood the unseen. Whereas medieval exorcism had emphasized ritual, moral authority, and communal oversight, and Enlightenment thought had sought to rationalize or explain phenomena, the film highlighted the dramatic, ethical, and existential stakes of confrontation with evil. The unseen was portrayed not merely as a theoretical danger or psychological curiosity, but as a visceral, morally charged force with the power to harm, corrupt, and challenge faith. The film created a new lens through which audiences could engage with centuries of spiritual tradition, translating ritual and theological complexity into a narrative that was emotionally immediate and morally compelling. The influence extended beyond film into literature, television, and popular discourse. Stories of possession proliferated in newspapers, magazines, and talk shows. The figure of the exorcist became a cultural archetype, and public awareness of historical and contemporary practices of spiritual intervention increased dramatically. The rituals of exorcism, once largely invisible outside ecclesiastical contexts, became shared cultural knowledge, accessible to anyone with curiosity, fear, or belief in the unseen. This democratization of spiritual awareness changed the social function of exorcism. It was no longer solely a tool of moral enforcement or personal healing, but also a means of exploring human vulnerability, ethical confrontation, and the metaphysical unknown in a collective cultural arena. Psychologically, the film reinforced the human tendency to externalize fear. By dramatizing possession, The Exorcist provided a narrative framework through which audiences could project anxieties, moral uncertainty, and existential dread. The story of exorcism became a metaphor for the struggle against internal and external chaos, the confrontation with forces beyond comprehension, and the assertion of moral and spiritual integrity in the face of overwhelming danger. In this sense, the cultural impact of the film mirrors centuries of ritualized exorcism. The unseen, whether interpreted as demon, spirit, or narrative device, functions as a means for human beings to navigate fear, confront moral dilemmas, and assert control over uncertainty. In the decades following the film's release, real-world exorcisms reportedly increased, with priests citing renewed awareness and concern about possession influenced by popular culture. Public fascination with demonology, spiritual warfare, and ritualized intervention intensified, demonstrating that media can act as a vector for belief, fear, and engagement with the unseen. The Exorcist did not invent exorcism. Rather, it amplified, dramatized, and disseminated centuries of spiritual knowledge, translating it into a form that could affect global consciousness, behavior, and imagination. Ultimately, the era of pop culture exorcism illustrates that the unseen persists in human life, not only through ritual and theology, but also through narrative, image, and shared cultural experience. The Exorcist, once a figure operating in private ritual space, became a symbol in mass consciousness, and the battle between human agency and spiritual intrusion was dramatized for audiences worldwide. Through film, literature, and media, the unseen was rendered simultaneously terrifying, morally compelling, and emotionally immediate, demonstrating that even in an era of scientific sophistication and secularism, humanity remains profoundly engaged with the unseen, the malevolent, and the morally charged dimensions of existence. Modern-day exorcists, doctors, priests, and shadow agreements. In the contemporary world, the practice of exorcism occupies a space at the intersection of tradition, psychology, medicine, and popular imagination. It is a domain in which centuries of ritual, moral authority, and theological understanding coexist uneasily with modern scientific frameworks, legal oversight, and widespread skepticism. Unlike earlier eras, when exorcists operated largely within ecclesiastical authority or tightly knit community structures, today's exorcisms occur in diverse contexts. Within the sacred walls of churches, in private homes, in hospitals, and sometimes at the margins of society, where belief, fear, and human vulnerability intersect. Modern-day exorcists must navigate not only spiritual challenges but also legal, ethical, and psychological frameworks, often entering what can only be described as a shadow territory, where human suffering, unseen forces, and institutional responsibility overlap. The contemporary exorcist may be a priest, a minister, or a spiritual healer, but increasingly, medical professionals are involved. Recognizing that many phenomena previously interpreted as possession may have neurological, psychiatric, or psychological roots, physicians, psychiatrists, and clinical psychologists often encounter individuals who display extreme behaviors, dissociative states, or psychotic symptoms that resemble historical accounts of possession. The modern exorcist, therefore, frequently collaborates with medical professionals, forming what some have described as shadow agreements, informal understandings in which both spiritual and medical frameworks are employed to address distress. A priest may perform ritual prayers while a doctor monitors physiological health. A psychiatrist may evaluate neurological function while a spiritual advisor ensures the patient's moral and emotional environment is supported. These hybrid interventions illustrate a pragmatic acknowledgement that human experience is complex, that unseen forces may be interpreted in multiple ways, and that spiritual and scientific approaches are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Despite the influence of psychology and medicine, spiritual frameworks remain central for many modern practitioners. The rituals codified centuries earlier, prayers, holy water, the invocation of saints, and the careful delineation of moral authority, continue to guide practice. Modern exorcists are trained to discern, with acute attention, whether a case warrants intervention, to identify signs of genuine spiritual disturbance versus mental illness, and to approach each situation with a balance of caution, authority, and empathy. Training often emphasizes ethical responsibility, recognizing that exorcism carries not only spiritual risk, but also potential psychological harm if conducted improperly. The interplay of authority, moral integrity, and procedural rigor in the 21st century mirrors centuries-old traditions, even as practitioners operate within vastly different social and scientific contexts. The use of ritual today also reflects adaptation to contemporary realities. While some exorcisms are conducted in formal church settings, others occur in private or semi-public spaces, mediated by the needs, beliefs, and comfort of the afflicted and their families. Prayer, incantation, and ritual objects remain central, yet exorcists today may also incorporate modern technology, recording devices, video surveillance, or medical monitoring to document phenomena, ensure safety, and bridge the gap between subjective spiritual experience and empirical verification. In this way, the modern practice of exorcism exemplifies a negotiation between ancient ritual knowledge and contemporary scientific rigor, producing a nuanced approach to human vulnerability and unseen influence. Public perception of exorcism in the modern era is heavily shaped by media, popular culture, and social narratives. Films, documentaries, and online content have amplified both fascination and skepticism, creating an environment in which the unseen is simultaneously sensationalized and questioned. Individuals seeking exorcism today may arrive with preformed ideas influenced by decades of cultural representation, blending historical, religious, and cinematic imagery. The modern exorcist, therefore, must navigate not only the spiritual and psychological dimensions of the work, but also the cultural expectations of those involved, ensuring that ritual remains effective while responding sensitively to fear, suggestion, and expectation. The social dimension of exorcism remains critical. It is as much about addressing collective belief, moral framework, and relational dynamics as it is about confronting an unseen entity. Cases of modern exorcism reveal the complexity of contemporary practice. Some involve individuals with profound religious faith experiencing perceived spiritual attack, requiring careful ritualized intervention and moral guidance. Others involve those with psychiatric diagnoses, where ritual and psychological therapy coexist to provide holistic support. In certain instances, families request exorcism as a form of moral reassurance, ethical alignment, or cultural continuity, reflecting the enduring human need to externalize fear, confront unseen influence, and assert agency over events beyond comprehension. Exorcists today, therefore, operate in a space that is simultaneously therapeutic, ritualistic, moral, and deeply relational, requiring skills that span centuries of tradition and contemporary knowledge. Ethical responsibility has become paramount in the modern era. Exorcists must carefully evaluate consent, ensure safety, and respect the autonomy of the afflicted. Misapplication can result in physical or psychological harm, legal liability, and spiritual misguidance. As a result, modern exorcists are often trained not only in ritual practice, but also in counseling, pastoral care, and crisis management. The role now encompasses multiple layers of authority: spiritual authority, rooted in centuries of codified ritual; psychological authority, grounded in observation and care; and social authority, exercised through communication, reassurance, and mediation between institutions, families, and individuals. Despite scientific advancement and secularization, belief in spiritual influence persists globally, across cultures, religions, and communities. Modern exorcism demonstrates the enduring relevance of centuries-old practices, revealing that human beings continue to grapple with fear, vulnerability, moral responsibility, and the unknown. While the methods, settings, and tools may have evolved, the core principles, discernment, ritual, moral integrity, and careful engagement with the unseen, remain central. Exorcists today serve as mediators, navigating a complex terrain in which the spiritual, psychological, and cultural dimensions of human life intersect, reflecting a continuity that links ancient Mesopotamian rituals, medieval European exorcisms, Enlightenment scrutiny, and even the cinematic imagination of the late 20th century. Ultimately, modern exorcists operate in a liminal space, bridging worlds both visible and invisible, scientific and spiritual, historical and contemporary. They confront human fear, suffering, and moral uncertainty while negotiating institutional, cultural, and psychological frameworks. Shadow agreements between priests and doctors, between ritual and therapy, reveal an understanding that human experience cannot be reduced to a single explanatory model. The unseen, whether interpreted as demonic, psychological, or metaphorical, remains a potent force in shaping human behavior, belief, and moral action. Modern exorcism is thus both a continuation of a millennia-old tradition and a dynamic adaptation to contemporary realities, affirming that the human need to understand, confront, and negotiate with the unseen persists as profoundly today as it ever has. Neuroscience, trauma, and the new question: what is possessing us now? As we move into the 21st century, the conversation around possession, exorcism, and the unseen has evolved in ways that reflect not only our technological advancement, but also our deepening understanding of the human mind. The question that confronts modern society is no longer solely whether spirits, demons, or malevolent forces exist in the traditional sense, but how the human brain, psyche, and body produce experiences that feel indistinguishably real, terrifying, and transformative. In this era, exorcism intersects with neuroscience, psychology, trauma studies, and the broader cultural imagination, prompting the profound inquiry, what is truly possessing us now? Neuroscientific research has revealed the staggering complexity of the human brain, its capacity for perception, imagination, and altered states, and the ways in which these functions can produce phenomena historically interpreted as spiritual interference. Conditions such as dissociative identity disorder, epilepsy, psychosis, and sleep paralysis produce experiences that parallel centuries-old accounts of possession. Voices that speak, entities that command, sensations of intrusion, and dramatic behavioral shifts. Modern neuroscience demonstrates that these experiences are rooted in biological and neurological processes, yet this does not diminish their subjective reality. Individuals experiencing these states perceive them as fully external, real, and threatening, and the physiological and psychological responses they evoke are powerful, immediate, and sometimes devastating. Trauma has emerged as a central concept in understanding contemporary possession. Psychologists and trauma specialists recognize that unprocessed emotional and psychological wounds can manifest in ways that mimic or mirror historical possession. Intrusive memories, flashbacks, dissociation, and hyperarousal can produce sensations of being controlled, watched, or invaded by forces beyond one's control. The body itself retains memory in ways that transcend conscious awareness, and trauma can surface as behavior, speech, and somatic expression that resembles spiritual affliction. In this sense, modern possession can be understood as embodied trauma, a reflection of both internal struggle and unresolved external harm, echoing the fears and anxieties that historical exorcisms sought to address. Yet, even with these scientific frameworks, the cultural and symbolic power of the unseen remains profound. Humans are wired to interpret experience through narrative, morality, and relational frameworks. The very language of possession, being taken over, controlled, or haunted, persists because it communicates a universal human experience, the confrontation with forces, internal or external, that feel larger than oneself. Neuroscience and trauma studies offer explanations, but they do not necessarily negate the lived reality of the afflicted, nor the profound moral, emotional, and social dimensions that accompany such experiences. In this sense, modern exorcism and spiritual intervention continue to serve a purpose, mediating fear, moral uncertainty, and the need for narrative coherence in the face of experiences that feel unexplainable and threatening. In contemporary practice, the interplay between neuroscience, psychology, and spiritual ritual has given rise to integrative approaches. Some mental health professionals collaborate with spiritual practitioners, recognizing that ritual, prayer, and symbolic engagement can produce measurable benefits, even when the source of affliction is psychological. Guided rituals may provide focus, structure, and moral reassurance. Prayer and sacred gestures can serve as tools for coping, grounding, and emotional regulation. This convergence illustrates a new kind of exorcism, one in which the unseen may be understood metaphorically, neurologically, or psychologically, but is still addressed through ritualized, intentional, and ethically guided action. The exorcist of today, in some cases, functions simultaneously as healer, moral guide, and facilitator of psychological integration. Modern research into consciousness has further expanded the horizon of what possession might mean. Studies on altered states of consciousness, induced through meditation, sensory deprivation, trance, and psychedelics, reveal that the human mind is capable of experiencing reality in ways that are profoundly mutable. Perceptions of external entities, intrusive presences, or controlling forces can emerge spontaneously, shaped by expectation, prior experience, cultural narrative, and neurochemical processes. The brain itself, in moments of heightened stress, fear, or vulnerability, can generate the perception of an external agent with distinct intention and morality, mirroring classical descriptions of spirits, demons, or intrusive entities. In this way, what is possessed may not be the body or soul alone, but the very perception of reality itself, the lens through which consciousness interprets experience, morality, and selfhood. Cultural context continues to shape modern experiences of possession. In societies where religious belief is strong, the interpretation of intrusion as spiritual or demonic remains common. In secular or scientifically oriented contexts, the same experiences may be interpreted as neurological anomaly, trauma response, or psychological phenomenon. Yet the universality of the experience, fear, helplessness, moral unease, and the sense of agency being compromised, persists across cultures, reminding us that possession, in whatever form it takes, remains a central human concern. Modern exorcists, mental health professionals, and spiritual guides all grapple with this intersection, recognizing that the unseen can manifest as threat, confusion, or insight, and that the boundary between mind, body, and spirit is simultaneously fragile and powerful. The philosophical implications are profound. If possession is now understood through neuroscience and trauma, it forces a reconsideration of moral agency, responsibility, and the limits of human understanding. The historical exorcist confronted a clearly defined adversary, often located outside the self. The modern exorcist, healer, or therapist confronts a force that may reside entirely within the psyche, within the body, or within the interplay between brain, culture, and environment. The battle is internal and external, literal and metaphorical, a confrontation with forces that are as elusive and complex as the human condition itself. In this context, the question arises, what does it mean to be possessed now? Perhaps it is not a spirit in the classical sense, nor a demon with intent, but a manifestation of fear, trauma, and neurobiological complexity, made tangible through narrative, ritual, and belief. Possession becomes a lens through which humanity understands vulnerability, morality, consciousness, and relational dynamics. Rituals, prayers, and exorcisms persist not because unseen forces are objectively verifiable, but because they provide frameworks for engagement with profound human experience, the struggle to assert agency, restore equilibrium, and navigate forces beyond comprehension. As technology, neuroscience, and psychological understanding continue to advance, modern exorcism reflects a dynamic negotiation between old and new. The unseen is not dismissed, it is reinterpreted, engaged, and integrated. The exorcist of today may be a priest, a doctor, a therapist, or a guide, but the core function remains: to confront what threatens the balance of the human mind, body, and spirit, to negotiate the forces that compromise agency, and to facilitate the restoration of wholeness. The tradition of exorcism, stretching from ancient Mesopotamia through medieval Europe, the Enlightenment, spiritualist séances, and cinematic dramatization, persists because the unseen, whether external or internal, remains a central axis around which human fear, morality, and understanding revolve. In the 21st century, we recognize that possession is multifaceted, situated at the intersection of brain chemistry, traumatic memory, cultural narrative, and the profound human need to understand what lies beyond conscious control. Neuroscience and trauma studies do not negate centuries of ritual, belief, and spiritual intervention. Instead, they deepen our understanding of why these practices endure, and why the human imagination continues to seek, confront, and ritualize the unseen. In this sense, the question of possession is eternal, adapting to the knowledge, tools, and understanding of each era, yet consistently reminding us of a singular truth. Humanity is always negotiating forces beyond comprehension, whether called spirits, demons, trauma, or consciousness itself. And through this negotiation, we confront not only what possesses us, but what it means to be fully, vulnerably, and morally human. I hope you enjoyed tonight's sleep story, journeying through the entire history of exorcisms, from the first beliefs in spirits before writing, through the ritual protections of Mesopotamia, the spiritual battles of ancient Egypt, the oracles of Greece, Roman practices, Vedic chants, Buddhist and Shinto purifications, African trance work, the exorcisms of Jesus, early Christian rites, Islamic Ruqyah, medieval European diagnoses, witch trials, Enlightenment skepticism, 19th century spiritualism, the Catholic codification of 1614, cinematic transformations, modern exorcists, and finally to the insights of neuroscience and trauma in understanding what truly possesses us today. If you're still awake, that's perfectly all right. Let your mind drift gently, as if floating above quiet cities and forests, over oceans and ancient ruins, where the echoes of countless rituals, prayers, and whispered invocations fade softly into the night. There's nothing left to hold on to now. Allow every thought to soften and dissolve, like candlelight flickering, until only calm remains. And if you'd like to continue your journey into rest, you can always explore more of our sleep stories, from myths and legends to historical mysteries, each crafted to guide your mind into peaceful, restorative slumber. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. Wherever you are, may your night be calm, your dreams gentle, and your rest deep and renewing. Sleep well.